The galaxy in the 31st millennium groaned under the weight of unending war. From the Outer Rim territories to the heart of ancient Terra, humanity's children bore witness to conquest after conquest in the name of the Emperor's great design. Yet among all the triumphs carved from alien flesh and heretical stone, none carried the bitter taste of tragedy, quite like the events that unfolded beneath the ash-grey skies of Monarchia. Lorgar Aurelian, the golden son of Colchis, stood before the smouldering ruins of his perfect city, with tears streaming down his face. The Urizen, they had called him in whispered prayer. The bearer of the word, the first among his brothers to see divinity in their father's light and proclaim it to the stars. But divine light, it seemed, cast shadows far deeper than any mortal darkness. The Ultramarines had done their work with characteristic precision. Where once soaring spires of white marble had reached toward heaven in eternal supplication, now only blackened foundations remained. The great libraries that had housed 1,000,000 copies of the Lectitio Divinitatus lay as char and memory. The golden aquilus that had adorned every surface, each one crafted with loving devotion by human hands, were now twisted into unrecognizable slag. Behind Lorgar, 100,000 space marines knelt in the ashes. The 17th Legion, the word-bearers, pressed their faces to the ground in forced supplication not to their beloved Primarch, but to the figure who now descended from the lead Thunderhawk with steps that shook the very earth. The master of mankind had come to Kur, and his displeasure burned like a dying star. Robut Guilliman emerged from his father's shadow, his noble features etched with unease. The Lord of Ultramar had executed his orders without question, yet something in his bearing suggested the victory felt hollow. His warriors had raised Monarchia not as conquerors celebrating triumph, but as executioners carrying out a grim sentence. The weight of that distinction pressed upon him now as he watched his brother's anguish. "Look upon your folly, my son," the Emperor spoke, his voice carrying across the devastation like judgment rendered upon eternity. "See what your misguided worship has wrought." Lorgar raised his head, golden eyes blazing with hurt and confusion. "Father, we built this city as a monument to your glory. Every stone was placed with love, every prayer offered in your honor. I am no god," the Emperor thundered, psychic might flowing from him in waves that forced even the space marines to press themselves lower against the ash. "I am a man of science and reason, and I will suffer no such delusion in my realm." The word-bearer's Primarch struggled to his feet, swaying like a man struck by lightning. "Then what are we, Father? What is the point of this great crusade, if not to bring the light of your divinity to the darkness?" Silence stretched across the ruins, broken only by the distant rumble of Imperial aircraft circling overhead. When the Emperor spoke again, his voice had grown cold as the void between stars. "You are my greatest disappointment, Lorgar Aurelian. Of all my sons, you alone have failed to understand the truth of what we build." Guilliman stepped forward, alarm flickering across his features. "Father, surely—" "Stand down, Robut." The Emperor's gaze never left Lorgar's face. "This corruption runs too deep. It cannot be allowed to spread." The Golden Primarch laughed then, a sound like breaking crystal that carried across the ash-strewn plain. "Corruption? I showed them hope, Father. I gave them something to believe in beyond the grinding machinery of conquest. I offered them the one thing your sterile truth cannot provide: meaning. And in doing so, you opened doorways that should remain forever sealed." The Emperor's eyes blazed with terrible light. "Even now, I sense the whispers of powers that hunger for such devotion. powers that would see humanity enslaved to spiritual darkness. From among the kneeling word-bearers, two figures exchanged glances that spoke of deeper knowledge. Corpharon, Lorgar's foster father and first captain, felt his augmetic hand clench involuntarily. Beside him, Erebus, the Legion's first chaplain, whispered prayers to gods the Emperor had never named, but somehow knew. The ruinous powers had indeed taken notice of Monarchia's devotion, yet their chosen son remained ignorant of their attention. "You speak of doorways, father," Lorgar said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "But what of the doorways you close? What of the doors to hope, to purpose, to something greater than mere survival? You would leave humanity spiritually starved in the name of your imperial truth." The words hung in the air like a curse, and even Guilliman felt their weight. The Emperor's face remained impassive, but those who knew him best could see the flicker of something that might have been regret. Yet when he spoke, his voice carried only finality. "Then let this be a lesson to all who would repeat your errors." The Emperor extended his hand, and golden fire began to gather around his fingers. "Lorgar Aurelian, by the authority vested in me as master of mankind, I find you guilty of heresy against the imperial truth. The penalty is death." "Father, no!" Guilliman stepped between them, his own hand moving instinctively to his sword hilt. "He is our brother. He can be redeemed." "Can he?" The Emperor's gaze shifted to the Lord of Ultramar, and for a moment the weight of 10,000 years seemed to press upon his shoulders. "The rot has spread too far, my son. To show mercy here would be to invite catastrophe. The galaxy's spiritual hunger must not be fed by false gods." Across the kneeling ranks of word-bearers, whispers of shock and growing anger began to spread. These were the Emperor's chosen warriors, devoted beyond measure to their gene-father and his vision, to watch their Primarch condemned not for failure in battle, but for the depth of his devotion struck them like a blade to the heart. Lorgar straightened to his full height, no longer the weeping figure who had mourned Monarchia's destruction. "You would execute your own son for loving you too much?" "I execute a cancer before it spreads," the Emperor replied, the golden fire around his hand growing brighter. "Your love was never in question, my son. But love without wisdom becomes worship, and worship without understanding becomes damnation." The Primarch of the Word-Bearers spread his arms wide, no longer trying to defend himself. "Then do it, father. But know this. In killing me, you plant seeds that will one day bloom into the very spiritual starvation you fear. Humanity will seek gods, whether you permit them or not. And if you offer them only empty truth, they will find darker alternatives." The prophecy fell from his lips with the weight of revelation, and even the Emperor paused. In that moment of hesitation, Lorgar smiled with the terrible serenity of a martyr. "The galaxy will burn, father, not because I loved you, but because you taught it that love itself is heresy." Golden fire erupted from the Emperor's hand, engulfing the word-bearer Primarch in light that briefly outshone Kur's dying sun. When the radiance faded, nothing remained of Lorgar Aurelian, but scattered ash that the wind caught and scattered across the ruins of his perfect city. The silence that followed was absolute. 100,000 space marines remained frozen in their kneeling positions, minds struggling to process what they had witnessed. Their father, their gene sire, their beloved Primarch, gone, reduced to nothing by the hand of the very god he had proclaimed. Corpharon was the first to move, rising slowly from his prostration with murder in his augmetic eyes. Beside him, Erebus clutched a pendant that seemed to pulse with unnatural warmth, a gift from certain patrons who had long awaited such a moment. The Emperor's great work had gained its first martyrs, and martyrs, they knew, were powerful things. "Robute," the Emperor spoke, his voice carrying exhaustion that 10,000 battlefields had never produced. "The 17th Legion is disbanded. Distribute their warriors among the other legions as penance troops. Let their shame be shared, so that their corruption might be diluted." Guilliman stared at the patch of earth where his brother had stood, his tactical mind already calculating the ramifications. "Father, the word-bearers were never our least effective legion. To destroy them entirely was necessary," the Emperor interrupted, turning away from the scene of execution. "What I have done here will echo through history, my son. But the alternative would have been far worse." As the master of mankind strode back toward his transport, the wind picked up across Monarchia's ruins, carrying with it the ashes of a Primarch and the whispered oaths of those who had loved him. The Great Crusade would continue, but something fundamental had changed in its character. The Emperor had chosen ruthless pragmatism over paternal mercy, and the galaxy would never quite recover from that choice. The first seeds of the long war had been planted not in corruption, but in the ashes of absolute judgment. And in the shadows cast by that terrible justice, darker powers began to smile. The winds of Kur carried more than ash in the days that followed. Across the galaxy, word of Lorgar's execution spread like wildfire through the ranks of the Space Marine legions, igniting whispers of shock, disbelief, and something that dared not speak its name: doubt. The 17th Legion, once 100,000 strong, now knelt scattered across a dozen worlds as their new masters decided their fates. Corfaron stood in the holding bay of the Ultramarine's battle barge Courage Above All, his augmetic hand clasped behind his back in a pose of humble submission. The irony was not lost on him. For 43 years, he had served as Lorgar's closest advisor, the foster father who had shaped the Primarch's spiritual awakening on Colchis. Now he wore the expression of a penitent, while his heart burned with hatred for the golden tyrant who had murdered his son. "Your records indicate exemplary service to the 17th Legion," Captain Ventress of the 4th Company said, consulting the data slate before him. "No disciplinary actions. No signs of the religious extremism that marked your Primarch's downfall." "I served loyally, my lord," Corfaron replied, his voice carrying just the right note of sorrowful regret. "Perhaps I should have done more to guide Lord Aurelian away from his misguided devotions. The guilt will follow me to my grave." Ventress nodded approvingly. The captain had witnessed Monarchia's destruction, had seen the tears in Guilliman's eyes as the Ultramarines carried out their grim duty. Like many of his brothers, he hoped that mercy might yet salvage something worthwhile from the word-bearers' wreckage. "You'll be assigned to the redemption squads. Prove your loyalty through deed rather than word, and perhaps you can wash the stain of the 17th Legion from your honor." Corfaron bowed low, concealing the bitter smile that touched his lips. Redemption indeed. If only these naive fools knew what gods already waited to receive their devotion. Aboard the strike cruiser Eisenstein, Erebus faced his own interrogation with equal cunning. Captain Garrow of the Death Guard studied the former first chaplain with eyes that had seen too many battlefields to be easily deceived. Yet even he could not pierce the veil of deception that years of secret worship had taught Erebus to weave. The Emperor's judgment was harsh but necessary, Erebus said, each word carefully chosen to project the image of a broken man seeking redemption. My Primarch's obsession with the divine blinded him to his duties. I failed him as his spiritual advisor, failed to guide him toward the imperial truth. "And yet you preached alongside him for decades," Garrow observed, his battle-scarred features remaining impassive. "You helped craft the very doctrines that led to his downfall." "A burden I will carry forever, my lord." Erebus's voice cracked with manufactured emotion. "But if the Death Guard will have me, I swear to serve the Emperor's true vision. No more false gods, no more spiritual poison, only duty, honor, and the Great Crusade." Garrow studied him for a long moment, then made a mark on his data slate. "Redemption Squad 7. You'll serve under Sergeant Grulgor. Any sign of your old heresies, and you'll join your Primarch in the afterlife he preached about." "I understand, Captain. Thank you for this chance." As Erebus was led away to his new quarters, his fingers traced the hidden pendant beneath his robes. The small icon, carved from what mortals called obsidian, but which those with true sight knew to be crystallized warp energy, pulsed with warmth against his chest. The ruinous powers had not abandoned their faithful servants, simply because their most vocal prophet had been silenced. Across the fleet, similar scenes played out as word-bearer veterans were distributed among the loyal legions. Most went to the Ultramarines, their new brothers viewing them with mixtures of pity and suspicion. Others found themselves assigned to the Iron Warriors, where Perturabo's forces welcomed additional siege specialists without asking too many questions about their past allegiances. The Death Guard accepted several companies' worth of former 17th Legion Marines, while the Alpha Legion quietly claimed a number of the more flexible word-bearer operatives. Yet for every veteran who bent the knee in apparent repentance, a dozen more thoughts turned to darker purposes. In the depths of troop transports and barracks, whispered conversations began to take shape. Not about Lorgar's teachings, those were too dangerous now, but about older truths, ancient powers that had walked between the stars since before humanity's first breath. Brother Sergeant Jarulek, newly assigned to an Iron Warriors garrison on Hydra Caudatus, found himself working alongside Battle Brother Honso during a routine patrol of the fortress world's perimeter. The Iron Warrior was young by Astartes standards, his face still unmarked by the bitter cynicism that seemed to infect Perturabo's sons as they aged. "Tell me about Monarchia," Honsu said, as they walked the battlements. "The official reports say little, but you were there." Jarulek was quiet for a long moment, his enhanced senses scanning the horizon for threats that never came to this heavily fortified world. "Have you ever seen a perfect city, brother?" "I've seen many cities." "No, I mean perfect. Every line, every angle, every decoration placed with love and purpose. Monarchia was... It was beautiful beyond anything I had seen in 2 centuries of war. The people there didn't fear us. They welcomed us as angels." Jarulek's voice grew distant. "Children would run to touch our armor. They sang hymns that made even the most battle-hardened among us weep." Honsu frowned. "But it was built on lies, false worship of the Emperor." "Was it?" Jarulek turned to face his new battle brother, and something in his eyes made Honso step back. "The Emperor's light burned in that city, brother. Whether he wished it or not, divinity touched those stones, and when it was destroyed," he shook his head, "nature abhors a vacuum. When one god is denied, others rush to fill the void." "You speak dangerously, Jarulek. I speak truly, and truth, brother Honso, is the most dangerous thing of all." That conversation, repeated in countless variations across the scattered remnants of the 17th Legion, began to bear fruit in the weeks that followed. The Iron Warriors, already embittered by decades of thankless siege warfare, found themselves increasingly receptive to whispers about entities that might reward their sacrifices. The Alpha Legion, ever eager to acquire new secrets, discovered that their word-bearer recruits possessed knowledge of hidden cults and forbidden rituals that could prove useful. Most concerning of all was the Death Guard. Captain Garrow's ship carried more former word-bearers than any vessel save the Ultramarines' flagship, and among them moved Erebus like a virus, spreading through healthy tissue. His redemption was exemplary, his devotion to duty absolute. Yet somehow, in the months that followed, the Death Guard Marines aboard the Eisenstein began to report strange dreams. Visions of gardens where decay bloomed eternal. Whispers of grandfatherly voices that promised peace through acceptance of entropy's embrace. Meanwhile, on distant Terra, the Emperor convened his war council in the depths of the Imperial Palace. The Primarchs who could be spared from their conquests gathered in the chamber of the Astronomicon, their immortal forms casting long shadows beneath the golden light. Robert Guilliman stood at the Emperor's right hand, his noble features still marked by the weight of Monarchia's destruction. The execution of the 17th Legion's Primarch sends a clear message, the Emperor declared, his voice echoing from the walls of black marble. There will be no tolerance for religious deviation within my realm. The imperial truth is absolute. Rogel Dawn, ever the pragmatist, stepped forward. With respect, Father, was execution truly necessary? Censure, reduction of forces, public humiliation, any of these might have achieved the same result without martyring the wretch. Would they? The Emperor's golden eyes blazed with terrible intensity. Lorgar's corruption was spreading, my son. Even now, I sense echoes of his influence rippling through the warp. His death was the only way to cauterize the wound. Vulcan, his massive frame draped in drake scales, spoke with reluctance. The 18th Legion asks no questions about our orders, Father. But the Marines speak among themselves. They wonder if any of us might face such judgment for lesser failings. Let them wonder, the Emperor replied coldly. Fear of consequences has always been wisdom's beginning. Guilliman shifted uncomfortably. Father, I must report growing unrest among the former word-bearers assigned to my legion. They serve loyally, but there are whispers, questions about the nature of faith itself. Which is precisely why they were scattered, the Emperor said. Diluted among loyal forces, their poison will be weakened until it poses no threat. Yet even as those words were spoken, across the galaxy, that very poison was finding new hosts. In the depths of the Eisenstein, Erebus knelt in his private cell and whispered prayers to powers that had waited 10 million years for such devotion. On Hydra Caudatus, Jarolek shared forbidden knowledge with iron warriors, whose hearts already harbored resentment against their aloof father. Aboard a dozen ships, in countless barracks, the scattered faithful of the 17th Legion planted seeds that would one day bloom into damnation itself. Cor Phaeron, meanwhile, had begun his own pilgrimage of sorts. Officially assigned to a redemption squad investigating compliance violations on the world of Davin, he found himself walking ancient paths that predated humanity's arrival in the galaxy. The tribal shamans spoke of entities that dwelt between the stars, beings of such power that even thinking their names could attract their attention. Your false emperor destroyed our son, he whispered to the shadows that seemed to gather at the world's edge. But martyrs, I have learned, are powerful things. We offer you his suffering, his love perverted to hatred, his faith transformed into vengeance. In return, the shadows whispered back, and Cor Phaeron smiled for the first time since Monarchia's fall. The great crusade would continue its march across the stars, but it would no longer march alone. In its wake, following like patient predators, came powers older and hungrier than the Imperium had ever imagined. The scattering of the faithful had begun, and faith once planted in fertile soil, proved remarkably difficult to root out. The moons of Devon had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations for 10,000 years, their surfaces scarred by wars between tribes whose gods demanded blood and whose shamans whispered secrets that made the warp itself recoil. Yet none of those ancient conflicts had prepared the world for what now approached through the void, a desperate gambit by powers that had lost their most devoted servant and now sought to claim an even greater prize. Erebus stood in the cramped observation deck of the Death Guard strike cruiser, Terminus Est, watching as the Lunar Wolves' fleet dropped from the warp in perfect formation. The sight of Horus's flagship vengeful spirit emerging from the roiling Imperium should have filled him with anticipation. Instead, he felt only the cold weight of uncertainty. Without Lorgar's guidance, without the careful decades of preparation that the word-bearers had once enjoyed, this would be a crude affair. Brutal. Desperate. The War Master moves against the Oretian technocracy as planned, Captain Typhon observed, his voice carrying the typical Death Guard disdain for anything that required subtlety. Your intelligence about their rebellion was accurate. The Lodge of the Serpent has many eyes, Erebus replied, his fingers unconsciously tracing the hidden pendant beneath his armor. They see much that escapes imperial notice. It had taken months of careful manipulation to arrange this convergence. The Oretian technocracy's rebellion was real enough, a cluster of worlds on Davin's edge that had declared independence from the Imperium, citing oppressive taxation and forced conscription. What Typhon didn't know, what even the War Master himself didn't suspect, was how that rebellion had been carefully orchestrated by whispered suggestions from lodge members who served masters far older than the Emperor. The plan was simple in its desperation. Horus would lead the assault personally, as he always did. The tribal warriors of Davin, armed with weapons touched by powers that dwelt between the stars, would wound him with a blade that carried more than mere poison. And in his moment of weakness, the Lodge would offer healing that came with a price the War Master could never imagine. But even as Erebus watched the Lunar Wolves deploy their drop pods, he felt the familiar chill of doubt. Lorgar would have spent years preparing for this moment. Years of careful corruption, of planting seeds in fertile soil, of ensuring that every variable was controlled. Instead, Erebus had mere months and access to powers that regarded patience as weakness. On the surface of Davin, the Serpent Lodge gathered in chambers carved from volcanic glass, their chants echoing through caverns that seemed to extend far deeper than physics should allow. The governor-militant Yugan Temba knelt before their altar, his augmetic eye glowing with unnatural light as entities whispered promises in languages that predated human speech. "The false emperor's champion comes," Temba intoned, his voice carrying harmonics that made even hardened warriors step back. "The blade is prepared. The ritual is ready. But will it be enough?" The answer came not in words, but in visions that seared themselves into the minds of all present. They saw the War Master falling, saw his perfect form writhing in agony as competing forces battled for his soul. But they also saw something else, a crimson figure wreathed in psychic fire, a son of the Emperor whose sight pierced veils that should have remained closed. "Magnus!" one of the Lodge members whispered, and the name seemed to echo through dimensions that mortal tongues were never meant to touch. The attack, when it came, unfolded exactly as Erebus had planned. Horus led the assault on the governor's palace with characteristic courage, his weapon cutting through traitor guards with surgical precision. The Lunar Wolves followed their gene father with absolute devotion, their battle cries echoing from ancient stone as they carved a path toward Temba's stronghold. Yet something felt wrong from the beginning. The resistance was too fierce, too coordinated. The weapons wielded by Davin's defenders carried an edge that went beyond mere steel, leaving wounds that festered with unnatural corruption. Even veteran Astartes found themselves struggling against enemies who should have posed no threat. "My lord," Sergeant Abaddon called out, as his squad cleared another corridor. "The enemy is using some form of Xenos technology. These blades cut through ceramite like it was parchment." Horus nodded grimly, his own armor bearing scars from weapons that should never have touched him. "Press forward. Whatever corruption has taken this world, we'll burn it clean." The War Master's confidence proved prophetic, and yet tragically premature. In the throne room of the fallen governor, Yugan Temba waited with a blade that sang with whispered promises. The duel that followed was fierce, but brief. Horus was the greatest warrior humanity had ever produced, and even chaos-enhanced reflexes could not match his skill for long. But skill meant nothing when the enemy's weapon carried poison brewed in the cauldrons of entropy itself. The blade, when it found its mark between armor plates, delivered more than mere toxin. It carried the essence of corruption itself, a spiritual venom that began eating at the War Master's soul, even as his enhanced physiology fought to neutralize the physical threat. Horus staggered, his perfect form suddenly racked with convulsions that had nothing to do with biology and everything to do with the war now raging within his very essence. As he fell to one knee, the air around him began to shimmer with impossible colors, and whispers in a dozen languages started to fill the chamber. That was when Magnus the Red arrived. The Thousand Sons. Primarch had not been part of the original assault plan. His legion was engaged in compliance actions 3 sectors away, reducing worlds that resisted the imperial truth with applications of controlled psychic force. But Magnus possessed sight that extended beyond the merely physical, and the moment chaos touched his brother's soul, he felt it like a knife blade drawn across his own spirit. The teleportation was instantaneous and devastating. One moment, Horus knelt alone in Temba's throne room with only his lunar wolves as witness. The next, the chamber blazed with crimson light as Magnus materialized in a storm of psychic energy that sent even the most hardened Astartes stumbling backward. "Brother!" Magnus's voice carried harmonics that made the walls themselves vibrate. "What foulness dares to touch you?" The Crimson King's psychic sight immediately perceived what others couldn't. Writhing entities of pure malevolence that clung to Horus like spiritual leeches, feeding on his essence while pumping their own corruption into his soul. These were no mere demons, but fragments of the ruinous powers themselves, drawn by the scent of a prize beyond all imagining. "Get back!" Magnus commanded the lunar wolves, and the force of his will sent even Abaddon stumbling toward the chamber's entrance. "This corruption is beyond your comprehension." What followed was a battle fought on planes of existence that mortal minds were never meant to witness. Magnus hurled his consciousness into the warp itself, confronting entities that had been ancient when the first stars learned to burn. Psychic fire clashed with spiritual darkness as the Thousand Sons Primarch fought to tear the corruption from his brother's soul before it could take root. The Chaos entities fought back with fury that bordered on madness. They had waited eons for such an opportunity, had sacrificed their most devoted servant for this chance to claim the War Master. They would not be denied by a single psyker, no matter how powerful. Yet Magnus possessed advantages they had not accounted for. His loyalty to the Emperor burned with the purity of a star, and his love for his brother gave him strength that transcended mere psychic might. More importantly, he fought with knowledge, understanding of the warp's nature that chaos had hoped to keep hidden until it was too late. The battle raged for what felt like hours, but lasted only minutes in real time. In the throne room, Horus writhed between life and death, while two cosmic forces contended for his soul. His lunar wolves watched in horror as their gene father's perfect form was racked by seizures that no medicine could address, his augmetic eye flickering between its normal gold and an unnatural crimson that spoke of darker influences. When Magnus finally emerged victorious, it was not without cost. The Crimson King staggered backward, psychic blood streaming from his remaining eye as he fought to remain conscious. The corruption had been torn from Horus's soul, but not before leaving scars that would never fully heal. "Apothecary!" Abaddon roared, and the Lunar Wolves' medical staff rushed forward to tend their fallen Primarch. But even as they worked, all present could see that whatever had happened here went beyond physical injury. Horus's eyes opened slowly, their golden light steady but somehow diminished. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who had glimpsed truths that mortal minds were never meant to comprehend. "Magnus," he whispered, reaching out to grasp his brother's hand. "I saw them. I saw what waits in the dark between stars. The 1,000 suns." Primarch nodded gravely. "As did I, brother. And now we must ensure that Father knows of this threat before it spreads." It was then that Captain Garrow and his death guard entered the chamber, having followed Magnus's psychic signature through the palace corridors. Among them walked Erebus, his face a mask of perfect concern that concealed the howling fury beneath. The plan had failed. Worse than failed, it had been exposed. Magnus's intervention had not only saved Horus, but revealed the very existence of chaos corruption to one of the most powerful psychers in the galaxy. The secret that the word-bearers had guarded for decades was now known to the sons of the Emperor. "Lord Horus," Garrow said, his battle-scarred features creased with worry. "Our apothecaries stand ready to assist." But Magnus was already studying the chamber with his enhanced sight, perceiving the lingering traces of warp energy that clung to every surface. His gaze swept across the Death Guard contingent, pausing for just a moment on Erebus before moving on. Yet that moment was enough. "Captain Garrow," Magnus said carefully, "I believe there are matters we must discuss privately. Matters concerning the spiritual corruption that nearly claimed my brother." Erebus felt the psychic scrutiny like a physical weight, and in that instant he knew his time among the Death Guard was at an end. The 1,000 suns. Primarch might not yet understand the full scope of the conspiracy, but he had seen enough to begin asking the right questions. As Magnus and Garrow withdrew to speak in private, Erebus made his choice. The pendant beneath his armor grew warm against his skin, and he whispered words that tasted of brass and blood. When the guards came for him an hour later, following Magnus's increasingly specific accusations, they found only empty armor and the lingering scent of something that had never been entirely human. The Devin heresy, as it would come to be known in the secret archives of the 1,000 Suns, had failed in its immediate goal. Horus remained loyal, his soul scarred, but pure. Yet in its failure, it had achieved something perhaps more dangerous. It had revealed to the Imperium that enemies existed beyond the merely physical, that corruption could strike at the very heart of what made humanity human. The war for the galaxy's soul had begun, and both sides now knew the stakes. The halls of the Imperial Palace had witnessed many dark councils in their time, but none quite like the one that convened in the depths of the Sanctum Imperialis, 3 days after Magnus returned from Devin. The Crimson King's report had shattered assumptions that had stood unchallenged since the Great Crusade's earliest days, forcing the master of mankind to confront a truth he had hoped to delay for centuries yet to come. Malcador the Sigillite stood at the Emperor's right hand, his ancient features grave as he studied the psychic resonance traces that Magnus had extracted from the abandoned armor left behind by the entity calling itself Erebus. The former first chaplain's escape had been thoroughly supernatural, his physical form simply dissolving into warp energy while leaving behind only the ceramite shell he had worn. Yet even empty armor could hold memories, and those memories painted a picture that chilled even the regent's immortal soul. "Show me again," the Emperor commanded, his golden eyes fixed on the swirling images that danced above the chamber's central holotable. Magnus nodded wearily, the effort of repeated psychic reconstruction having taken its toll. The air shimmered, and suddenly the chamber filled with echoes of conversations that had taken place across decades. Erebus speaking with Corfaron in hushed tones on Colchis. Word-bearer chaplains spreading corruption through tribal societies on distant worlds. Most damning of all, the voice of Lorgar himself, preaching to assembled masses about powers that dwelt beyond the stars and hungered for human devotion. "The corruption extends far deeper than we initially suspected," Magnus reported, his voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who had spent days diving into the most polluted corners of the warp. This Erebus was not acting alone. The entire word-bearer command structure was compromised, and through them, the corruption has spread to other legions. The Emperor's silence stretched across long minutes, and even Malcador felt the weight of his contemplation. When the master of mankind finally spoke, his words carried the authority of absolute decision. The threat requires a response beyond conventional military action. These enemies fight not just for territory or resources, but for the souls of humanity itself. He turned to Malcador, and something in his gaze spoke of painful necessity. "Old friend, the time has come to create the organization we hoped never to need." Malcador bowed his head. "The Inquisition?" "Precisely. An organization with the authority to investigate any citizen of the Imperium, no matter their rank or station, equipped with the knowledge and tools necessary to detect spiritual corruption before it can spread, and granted the power to act with absolute authority in my name." Magnus shifted uncomfortably. "Father, such an organization could easily become a tool of oppression. How do we ensure it serves justice rather than paranoia?" "We don't," the Emperor replied bluntly. "The alternative is far worse than the risk of excessive zeal. Better that innocent men fear their neighbors than that guilty men corrupt entire worlds." The psychic interrogation of Erebus's abandoned armor and equipment yielded information that painted an even grimmer picture than initial reports had suggested. The corruption had not been confined to the word-bearers alone. It had spread like a virus through carefully placed individuals in multiple legions. Warrior lodges that had seemed like harmless military fraternities were revealed to be recruitment networks for entities that existed beyond mortal comprehension. Within a week of the Inquisition's formal establishment, purges began across the galaxy. The Iron Warriors, already bitter from decades of siege warfare and thankless garrison duty, found themselves subject to intensive investigation. Companies that had included former word-bearer redemption troops faced particular scrutiny, their every action dissected for signs of corruption. Brother Captain Kroger stood at attention in the interrogation chamber aboard the battle barge Iron Blood, his scarred features impassive as Inquisitor Volk paced before him. The newly appointed Inquisitor was a former member of the Custodian Guard, his golden armor exchanged for the black carapace of his new calling, yet he retained the predatory grace of one trained to guard the Emperor's person. Your company has shown unusual casualty rates in recent engagements, Folk stated, consulting the data slate in his augmetic hand. 30% higher than Legion average. Explain. My warriors fight harder than most, Kroger replied without emotion. When you've been on the siege lines for 2 centuries, you learn that the only way forward is through the enemy. Or perhaps they seek death for other reasons. Tell me about the lodges. Kroger's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. What lodges? The warrior fraternities, the informal gatherings where Marines from different companies share war stories and discuss matters beyond the chain of command. We know they exist, Captain. We know former word-bearers helped establish many of them. If such gatherings exist, they're harmless. Warriors need brotherhood beyond their immediate squad mates. Folk stopped pacing and fixed the Iron Warrior with a stare that seemed to pierce his very soul. Captain, I served in the Custodian Guard for 300 years. I have stood in the presence of the Emperor himself and felt the touch of his divine will. I know corruption when I sense it, and it clings to you like a shroud. The interrogation continued for hours, with Folk employing techniques learned from Magnus himself to probe for signs of spiritual taint. Yet for every question answered, 3 more arose. The corruption was subtle, woven into legitimate grievances and honest frustrations, until it became impossible to distinguish between justified resentment and supernatural influence. Meanwhile, on the distant world of Colchis, Corpharon moved through passages carved from volcanic stone, his augmetic eye casting crimson light on walls decorated with symbols that predated humanity's arrival in the galaxy. The former word-bearer had not been idle since his dispersal. Using contacts cultivated over decades of missionary work, he had established a network of safe houses across the sector, each one a potential stronghold for the growing Chaos cult. The purges have begun, reported Brother Sergeant Jarulek, who had arrived on Colchis after fleeing his Iron Warriors posting aboard a stolen shuttle. The false Emperor moves against us with the same brutality he showed our Gene father. Corpharon nodded grimly. Then we must accelerate our plans. The old ways must be preserved until the galaxy is ready to accept the truth of the primordial powers. Around them, in chambers that extended deep into Colchis's crust, other survivors of the 17th Legion worked to transcribe the knowledge that Lorgar's death had nearly destroyed. Sacred texts, ritual practices, the true names of entities that dwelt in the warp, all of it carefully preserved against a future where such wisdom would be desperately needed. Yet even as the purges raged across imperial space, offers of assistance came from unexpected quarters. The Alpha Legion, ever eager to demonstrate their loyalty, volunteered their services in hunting down Chaos cultists. Their Primarch Alpharius presented himself before the newly established Inquisition with proposals for infiltration operations that could root out corruption from within. My Legion specializes in exactly this type of warfare, he explained to Inquisitor General Volk during a private meeting aboard the battle barge Alpha. We can insert operatives into suspect organizations, gather intelligence, and eliminate threats before they manifest. Volk studied the Alpha Legion Primarch with practiced suspicion. And what does your Legion gain from such cooperation? The satisfaction of serving the Emperor's will, Alpharius replied with perfect sincerity. Plus the opportunity to demonstrate our value. Too many view the XX Legion as mere assassins and spies. This would prove our dedication to the Imperial cause. What Folk could not see, what even Magnus's enhanced perception might have struggled to detect, was the subtle network of corruption that already existed within the Alpha Legion's ranks. Unlike the crude conversion attempts practiced by the scattered word-bearers, the Alpha Legion's corruption was elegant, sophisticated, They had been touched by powers that appreciated subtlety over brute force, that understood the value of long-term planning over immediate gratification. Their offer was accepted, and within months, Alpha Legion operatives were embedded in Inquisition investigation teams across the galaxy. Officially, they served as expert infiltrators and intelligence gatherers. Unofficially, they ensured that certain investigations never reached completion, that particular suspects never faced interrogation, that specific evidence never reached inquisitorial archives. The Iron Warriors, meanwhile, found their resentment growing with each passing day of investigation and scrutiny. Companies that had shed blood for the Imperium across centuries of thankless siege warfare now found their loyalty questioned by interrogators who had never seen a shot fired in anger. The very warriors who had sacrificed everything for the Great Crusade were being treated as potential traitors. Perturabo himself was summoned to Terra to answer questions about his legion's reliability, a summons that struck him like a physical blow. To be called to account like a common criminal, to have his dedication questioned after decades of flawless service. It was an insult that burned deeper than any wound. "You seek corruption where none exists," he told the assembled inquisitors, his voice carrying the barely controlled fury of a master craftsman whose work had been declared worthless. "My warriors are bitter because they have been given the hardest tasks and received the least recognition. That is not corruption. That is justice deferred." The tensions came to a head during a gathering of Primarchs on Terra, where several of the Emperor's sons finally voiced their concerns about the growing paranoia that seemed to grip their father's administration. Guilliman, ever the diplomat, attempted to find middle ground between necessity and excess. "Father, I do not question the need for vigilance against this chaos threat," he said carefully. "But the current investigations are destroying morale across entire legions. We risk creating the very rebellion we seek to prevent." Dawn nodded in agreement. The Iron Warriors have served with distinction for 2 centuries. To subject them to such scrutiny based solely on their recruitment of former word-bearers seems excessive. The Emperor listened to their concerns in silence, his golden eyes revealing nothing of his thoughts. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of infinite years and terrible foresight. "You see the cost of vigilance, my sons, but you do not yet comprehend the cost of complacency. The entities we face are patient beyond mortal understanding. They will wait decades, centuries if necessary, for their corruption to bear fruit. A single compromised Marine can doom an entire world. A single corrupted captain can deliver a fleet to our enemies." "But father," Vulcan interjected, his massive frame radiating concern, "such paranoia breeds the very conditions that make corruption attractive. If we treat loyalty as suspect, why should anyone remain loyal?" The question hung in the air like an accusation, and for a moment, even the master of mankind seemed to struggle for an answer. When it came, his voice carried a note of sadness that few had ever heard from their father. "Because the alternative is damnation, my son. Not just for us, but for every human soul that will ever be born. The war we fight now is not for territory or resources. It is for the right of humanity to exist as something more than cattle for entities that feast upon despair." The meeting ended with no clear resolution, but the damage had been done. Doubt had crept into the hearts of several Primarchs, doubt about their father's methods and the direction of the Great Crusade itself. The very bonds that held the Imperium together were beginning to fray under the strain of necessary but brutal paranoia. In the depths of the Imperial Palace, Malcador worked late into the night, coordinating Inquisition operations across the galaxy while struggling with the moral weight of what they had unleashed. The organization was proving effective. Corruption was being detected and eliminated with ruthless efficiency. Yet the cost in trust, in the bonds that held imperial society together, was becoming impossible to ignore. "We are becoming the enemy we seek to defeat," he whispered to the Emperor during one of their private consultations. "Fear and suspicion are spreading faster than any corruption." The Emperor's response was as cold as the void between stars. "Then we must ensure our enemies fall before we do. The alternative is extinction, old friend. I would rather rule over ashes than allow humanity to become the plaything of gods." The First Inquisition was born not from triumph, but from desperate necessity. Its very existence a testament to how close the imperium had come to a catastrophe it barely understood. Yet in saving humanity from spiritual corruption, they had unleashed a different kind of poison, one that would slowly eat away at the trust and loyalty that made the Great Crusade possible. The cure, it seemed, might prove as deadly as the disease. The sacred mountains of Colchis had stood for millions of years, their peaks crowned with temples older than human civilization itself. Yet, as the crimson dawn broke across their ancient slopes, those same mountains trembled with forces that had never before walked openly upon material reality. The warp itself seemed to bleed through the fabric of space, manifesting horrors that should have remained forever imprisoned beyond the veil. Corfaron stood atop the highest spire of what had once been the Cathedral of Illumination, his augmetic eye blazing with unholy light as he surveyed the transformation of his homeworld. The former word-bearer had spent months in preparation, gathering the scattered faithful from across the sector and establishing strongholds in the deepest caverns beneath Colchis' crust. Now, with the ritual circles carved and the sacrifices made, he could finally reveal himself as what he had always been destined to become, the dark cardinal of powers that hungered for mortal devotion. "Behold!" he called out to the assembled throng of corrupted marines and cultists who filled the cathedral's nave, his voice carrying harmonics that made the very air shiver. The false emperor's lies burn away before the light of true divinity. His golden tyrant's throne shall crumble, and from its ashes shall rise the reign of the primordial powers. The response was a roar that shook the ancient stones, a sound that carried more than mere human voices. Among the crowd, creatures that had never been born of woman added their own terrible harmonies. Demons given form through sacrificial rites, entities of pure malice clothed in borrowed flesh. The word-bearers who had survived Lorgar's execution and the subsequent purges stood alongside their new allies, their power armor bearing symbols that hurt mortal eyes to look upon. Brother Sergeant Ankfen Sekhmet raised the twisted banner of the 17th Legion, its original golden eagle now transformed into something that seemed to writhe with malevolent life. Around him, his squad of veterans chanted litanies in languages that predated human speech, their voices weaving patterns of corruption that spread outward from the cathedral like ripples in a poisoned pond. The transformation of Colchis had not gone unnoticed. 3 sectors away, Magnus the Red jerked awake in his meditation chamber aboard the battle barge Photep, psychic alarms screaming through his enhanced consciousness. The Thousand Suns, Primarch had maintained psychic sentries throughout the galaxy since the Davin incident. Invisible watchers that monitored the warp for signs of large-scale corruption. Now those sentries brought news that chilled his immortal soul. "Impossible," he whispered, his remaining eye blazing with silver fire as he extended his consciousness across the void. "The levels of warp energy, it's as if someone has torn a hole between dimensions." Within hours, urgent astropathic messages were racing through the imperium toward Terra, carrying warnings that would reshape the Emperor's understanding of the chaos threat. This was no longer a matter of individual corruption or isolated cults. This was open rebellion, backed by powers that commanded armies of demons. On Terra, the Emperor received Magnus's report in the depths of his private sanctum, his golden features revealing nothing of the storm that raged within his mind. Yet those who knew him best could see the tension that suddenly gripped his immortal frame, the way his psychic presence seemed to contract inward as if preparing for some terrible exertion. "Malcador," he commanded, and the sigillite appeared as if summoned from thin air. "Convene the War Council, all available Primarchs, immediately, and prepare the Bucephalus for departure." The Regent's ancient features showed no surprise. "You intend to handle this personally. The corruption has reached a threshold that requires direct intervention. If we allow this rebellion to succeed, it will serve as a beacon for every chaos cult in the galaxy. The contagion must be burned out, at its source." The assembled Primarchs arrived within the day, their flagship escorts darkening the skies above Terra as the greatest military minds in human history gathered to plan what would become known as the Cultis Crusade. Guilliman stood at the tactical display, his noble features creased with concern as he studied the astropathic intelligence streaming in from the affected sector. "The corruption appears centered on the primary hive city," he reported, his voice carrying the weight of personal knowledge. "I know those streets, Father. I walked them during the early days of compliance. The population was completely devoted to Lorgar's teachings. If they've turned to darker powers, then they will burn." Perturabo interrupted, his scarred features set in granite determination. "Give me a single company of iron warriors and orbital bombardment coordinates. I'll reduce their strongholds to ash within a week." The Emperor studied his sons with eyes that seemed to see through time itself. "This will not be a simple matter of siege warfare, Perturabo. The enemy has access to powers that can reshape reality itself. Your expertise will be crucial, but we must be prepared for resistance unlike anything we have faced." Dawn stepped forward, his massive frame radiating quiet confidence. "The Imperial fists stand ready, Father. Whatever corruption has taken hold there, we will root it out." "As do the iron hands," added Ferrus Manus, his augmetic fingers clenching into fists of living metal. "Flesh is weak, but the strength of the machine is eternal. These diamonds will learn that truth before we are done." Yet even as the Primarchs pledged their legions to the coming assault, darker intelligence continued to arrive from Colchis. The planet's population had not simply turned to chaos, they were transforming, mutating into creatures that bore only passing resemblance to the humans they had once been. Worse still, the very laws of physics seemed to be breaking down in certain areas, with gravity reversing itself and time flowing backward in localized pockets. The Imperial fleet that departed Terra 3 days later was unlike any force assembled since the earliest days of the Great Crusade. The Emperor himself stood upon the bridge of the Bucephalus, his golden armor blazing with power that made even hardened Navy officers avert their eyes. Around him sailed the combined might of 5 Space Marine legions, the Ultramarines under Guilliman, the Iron Warriors under Perturabo, the Imperial Fists under Dawn, the Iron Hands under Ferrus, and a small but elite force of Thousand Sons led by Magnus himself. The translation from warp space above Colchis revealed a world transformed beyond recognition. Where once fertile plains had stretched between mountain ranges, now writhing forests of bone and sinew covered the landscape. The very sky burned with unnatural colors and shapes that defied geometric logic, wheeled through the upper atmosphere like predatory birds. "By the throne," breathed Admiral Ustander from his position at the fleet's command center. "What has happened to this world?" Magnus provided the grim answer. "Reality itself has been infected. The barrier between the material universe and the warp has been deliberately weakened, allowing entities from beyond to manifest physically. We're not just looking at rebellion, we're looking at invasion." The bombardment began immediately, lance batteries and macro cannons pouring fire into the corrupted landscape below. Yet where conventional weapons should have carved craters of molten glass, they instead seemed to splash harmlessly against barriers of solidified nightmare. The corruption had grown too strong to be eliminated from orbit alone. "Surface assault," the Emperor commanded, his voice carrying absolute authority. "We end this at its source." The drop pod assault that followed was a masterpiece of coordinated warfare, even under impossible conditions. Guilliman led the initial wave, his ultramarines carving landing zones from the twisted landscape with precise application of bolter and chain sword. Behind them came Perturabo's iron warriors, their siege specialists establishing fortified positions that could serve as staging areas for the main assault. The enemy response was immediate and overwhelming. Demons poured from rent in the earth itself, their forms shifting between states of matter as they sought to overwhelm the Imperial forces through sheer numerical superiority. Yet for every horror that emerged from the warp, Space Marine discipline and firepower exacted a terrible toll. Brother Captain Aeonid Thiel of the 13th Legion found himself leading his company through streets that seemed to rearrange themselves between one step and the next, fighting enemies that could only be killed through the precise application of sanctified ammunition and unwavering faith. Around him, his Marines adapted to impossible conditions with the flexibility that marked Guilliman's sons, turning each block into a fortress and every intersection into a killing field. Yet it was Perturabo who truly distinguished himself during the campaign. The Iron Warrior's Primarch had spent decades perfecting the art of siege warfare, reducing countless fortifications across the galaxy in service to the Great Crusade. Now he applied that same methodical expertise to breaking strongholds that existed partially outside normal space-time. "Establish overlapping fields of fire," he commanded from his command post, his tactical displays showing the ebb and flow of battle across the corrupted cityscape. "These diamonds follow patterns, even if those patterns exist in 11 dimensions. Find the mathematical constants and exploit them." His Iron Warriors responded with the cold precision of their gene father, turning their siege equipment toward targets that shifted between realities. Where conventional tactics failed, Perturabo's genius found solutions. Gravity wells to trap entities that could phase through matter, harmonic resonators to disrupt the frequencies that held demon flesh together, complex algorithms that predicted the movement of creatures that existed outside linear time. The breakthrough came on the 7th day of fighting, when Perturabo's calculations identified the source of the warp incursion, the Cathedral of Illumination, where Cor Pharon had established his primary ritual site. The Iron Warrior's Primarch personally led the assault on that twisted spire, his siege engineers carving a path through defenses that should have been impregnable. Cor Pharon waited for them in the cathedral's highest chamber, no longer entirely human in appearance. The corruption had reshaped his flesh into something that hurt to perceive directly, his augmetic eye now a burning portal that seemed to peer into realms beyond mortal comprehension. "Perturabo," he said, his voice carrying harmonics that made the air itself weep. "Still serving the Golden Tyrant, I see. Still building cages for humanity's spirit." "I serve order," Perturabo replied, his massive form filling the chamber's doorway. "You serve madness." The duel that followed was brief but decisive. Corphaeron had gained power beyond mortal understanding, his form wreathed in energies that could unmake matter with a thought. Yet Perturabo fought not as a warrior, but as an engineer, each blow precisely calculated to exploit the mathematical weaknesses inherent in demon-forged flesh. When the Dark Cardinal fell, his death scream tore holes in reality itself. The corruption that had transformed Colchis began to unravel, the demon armies losing cohesion as their anchor to material existence was severed. Yet even in defeat, Corphaeron managed one final act of defiance. "This is not the end," he whispered, as his form began to dissolve into component atoms. "The seeds are planted. The harvest will come." A portal of pure warp energy opened beneath his feet, and the former word-bearer vanished into realms where time held no meaning and space folded in upon itself. He was gone, but not destroyed, merely relocated to domains where he could continue his dark work, beyond the reach of imperial justice. The Emperor's response to Corphaeron's escape was swift and terrible. Standing in the ruins of the Cathedral of Illumination, his golden form blazing with power that made the very air around him ignite, he pronounced judgment on the world that had birthed such corruption. "This world shall serve as a monument to the price of heresy," he declared, his voice carrying to every corner of the planet. "Colchis will be rebuilt as a shrine to the imperial truth, its every stone a testament to the fate that awaits those who traffic with powers beyond human understanding." The reconstruction that followed would take decades, with entire cities razed and rebuilt according to plans drawn up by the Emperor's own architects. Yet even as imperial forces worked to purge the last traces of corruption from Colchis's soil, the campaign's true significance lay not in its immediate results, but in what it revealed about the changing nature of warfare itself. Perturabo had proven his loyalty beyond any doubt, his iron warriors bearing the brunt of the most dangerous fighting, while demonstrating tactical brilliance that saved countless imperial lives. The suspicions that had dogged his legion since the purges began were finally laid to rest, replaced by recognition of their crucial role in humanity's survival. Yet the campaign had also revealed the true scope of the chaos threat. This had been no mere rebellion, but an invasion from realms beyond mortal comprehension, fought against enemies that could reshape the very laws of physics to serve their malevolent purposes. The enemy they faced was not simply alien, but antithetical to existence itself. As the Imperial fleet departed Colchis orbit, leaving behind garrison forces to oversee the world's transformation, the Emperor stood alone on the Bucephalus's command deck and contemplated the implications of what they had witnessed. The war he had always known was coming had finally begun in earnest, and even his vast intellect struggled to calculate its ultimate cost. In the depths of the warp, Corphaeron knelt before entities whose true forms could not be perceived by mortal consciousness, his augmetic eye weeping tears of liquid metal as he reported his failure. Yet even in defeat, he had accomplished something valuable. He had proven that the barriers between dimensions could be breached, that demon armies could walk openly upon imperial worlds. The Colchis rebellion was over, but the long war had only just begun. The warp had never known patience. For 10 million years, the ruinous powers had stirred in their realm beyond reality, feeding on emotion and suffering while waiting for opportunities to extend their influence into the material universe. Yet they had learned the value of subtlety from their most devoted servant, the golden-tongued Primarch, who had taught them that corruption spread fastest when disguised as salvation. Now, With Lorgar's voice forever silenced, and his carefully laid plans in ruins, the gods of chaos found themselves forced into desperate action. Without the word-bearer's coordinated network to channel their will, the dark gods began reaching out directly to potential servants across the galaxy. The approach was crude, lacking the elegant manipulation that had marked their previous efforts. Where once they had whispered suggestions into receptive minds over decades of careful preparation, now they screamed demands for immediate submission. The results were predictably disastrous. Angron felt the first whispers during the pacification of Genna, as his world-eaters carved through Xenos resistance with their characteristic bloody efficiency. The campaign should have been routine. Another alien species brought to heel by the Imperium's inexorable advance. Yet as the Primarch led his warriors through the burning ruins of the Xenos capital, something reached out to him from beyond the veil of reality. The voice came not as words, but as pure sensation, speaking directly to the agony that had tormented him since childhood. The butcher's nails embedded in his skull by Nucerian slavers screamed their eternal song of rage and pain, yet now that familiar torment was joined by something else. A presence vast and terrible, offering relief from suffering that had defined his entire existence. Son of the mountains, the voice rumbled through dimensions that physics could not map. I have watched your struggles. I have tasted the fury that burns within your skull. Join me, and I will free you from the chains that bind your mind. Angron staggered, his massive frame swaying as visions crashed through his consciousness. He saw himself standing in an arena that stretched beyond the horizon, its sand made from the ground bones of countless warriors. Above him burned a sun the color of fresh blood, and in its light, the nails were gone. The pain that had been his constant companion since childhood was replaced by perfect clarity of purpose. You offer lies, Angron growled, his scarred hands clenching into fists. I have heard promises before. They always come with chains. The presence pressed closer, and suddenly the Primarch was no longer on Genna, but standing in a realm where the very air was made of crystallized violence. Before him towered a figure that could not be properly perceived, its form shifting between states of matter as brass armor merged with rivers of blood and weapons forged from pure aggression. No chains, the entity promised, and its voice carried the weight of 10 million battlefields. Only freedom. Freedom to be what you truly are, war incarnate. Join me, and I will make you the greatest killer who ever lived. For a moment that lasted eternity, Angron wavered. The promise was seductive, offering an end to pain that had driven him to the edge of madness countless times. Yet something in the offer felt wrong, too direct, too immediate. Lorgar would have spent years preparing him for such a moment, laying groundwork and building trust through carefully orchestrated experiences. This felt like desperation. I choose my own wars, Angron snarled, tearing his consciousness free from the vision through sheer force of will. I serve the Emperor. I serve humanity. The presence recoiled as if struck, its frustration echoing across dimensions. Yet even as it withdrew, it left something behind. A seed of doubt, a whisper of temptation that would return again and again until the Primarch's resolve finally cracked. Meanwhile, 3 sectors away, Fulgrim walked through the ruins of an Eldar craft world with the measured pace of someone appreciating a masterpiece. The Third Legion had encountered the dying vessel drifting through the void, its wraithbone hull cracked and leaking atmosphere into space. The Xenos within had long since perished, yet their artifacts remained, including weapons that sang with power that transcended mere technology. The demon sword called to him from the craft world's central shrine, its blade gleaming with metal that seemed to shift between silver and gold in the dying light. Fulgrim lifted it with hands that had crafted sculptures capable of moving mortals to tears, feeling the perfect balance that spoke to his artist's soul. "Beautiful," he whispered, testing the weapon's weight with a swordsman's appreciation. Perfectly balanced, absolutely exquisite. What he could not see were the entities that had been bound within the blade's structure, demon spirits that had waited eons for a wielder worthy of their gifts. They stirred at his touch, recognizing in the Primarch something that matched their own obsession with perfection. "You appreciate beauty." A voice like silver bells mixed with screaming metal whispered into his mind. "You seek perfection in all things. We can grant you both beyond mortal comprehension." Fulgrim paused, the sword held before him like an extension of his own arm. "Who speaks? Servants of she who thirsts, the Dark Prince, who understands that existence without beauty is meaningless. We offer you experiences beyond anything your limited flesh can imagine. Sensations that will make every battle a symphony, every victory a work of art." The visions that followed were seductive beyond description. Fulgrim saw himself leading charges, where every movement was choreographed perfection, where blood spilled in patterns that would make poets weep. He watched his legion transformed into living sculptures, their power armor decorated with impossible beauty, while their weapons carved masterpieces from enemy flesh. Yet like Angron before him, something about the approach felt wrong. The offer was too crude, too immediate. There were no months of careful seduction, no gradual introduction to forbidden knowledge. The entities within the sword wanted instant conversion, immediate submission to their will. "Perfection," Fulgrim said carefully, lowering the blade, "cannot be rushed. True art requires patience, planning, gradual refinement." He set the sword back on its altar, ignoring the frustrated screams that echoed through dimensions only he could hear. "I will find my own path to beauty." The demons raged at his refusal, yet they had learned something valuable. The Primarchs could be tempted, but not through brute force approaches. They required subtlety, time, and careful manipulation of their existing desires. Unfortunately for the ruinous powers, subtlety had been Lorgar's gift, not theirs. On distant Barbarous, Mortarion faced his own supernatural encounter as he investigated reports of plague outbreaks among the Death Guard's recruitment worlds. The disease had started on the agri-world of Galaspar, spreading through the population with unnatural speed and virulence. What should have been a simple quarantine and medical response had become something far more sinister. The Primarch walked through the quarantine zone in full environmental armor, his enhanced senses cataloguing symptoms that defied conventional medical knowledge. The plague victims did not simply die, they transformed, their flesh becoming something that was simultaneously dead and alive, rotting and regenerating in endless cycles. "Fascinating," he murmured, kneeling beside a victim whose body had become a garden of diseased flesh. Fungi and bacteria formed complex ecosystems across skin that should have been necrotic days ago. The pathogen is maintaining cellular function even as it destroys tissue structure. That was when he heard the laughter, deep, wet sounds that seemed to bubble up from infected wounds themselves. The diseased began to speak in unison, their voices creating harmonies that should have been impossible given their damaged vocal cords. "Death Guard," they sang, the words carrying undertones of acceptance and inevitability. "You fight against the natural order. You deny the beauty of decay. Join us, and know the peace that comes with accepting entropy's embrace." Mortarion stepped back as the infected began to rise, their movements unnaturally fluid, despite obvious structural damage to bones and joints. They surrounded him with expressions of beatific joy, reaching out with hands that dripped with substances that seemed to exist halfway between liquid and living tissue. "You are sick," he stated, his rebreather masking the horror in his voice. "This is not peace. This is disease." "Disease is life's teacher," the infected replied in perfect synchronization. "Without decay there can be no renewal. Without death, existence becomes stagnation. We offer you understanding of the eternal cycle." The vision that followed showed Mortarion a galaxy where death was not an ending, but a transformation, where disease served as evolution's finest tool. He saw his legion freed from the weakness of uninfected flesh, their bodies hosting ecosystems that granted them immortality through constant renewal. Yet like his brothers, Mortarion recognized the crudeness of the approach. This was not careful corruption, but desperate recruitment, lacking the patient groundwork that would make such offers truly tempting. "I serve life," he said, raising his scythe in preparation for cleansing fire. "Not whatever abomination you represent." The infected wailed as flame purged their diseased forms, yet their patron's attention had already moved on to other potential servants. The ruinous powers were learning that direct approaches yielded only resistance from the Emperor's sons. Across the galaxy, the scattered cells of former word-bearers faced their own confusion as contradictory commands began arriving through warp-touched communications. Where once they had received coordinated instructions from a unified command structure, now they found themselves pulled in different directions by competing divine voices. Brother Sergeant Jarolek, still embedded with the Iron Warriors on Hydra Caudatus, clutched his head as 4 different entities simultaneously demanded his attention. Khorne commanded immediate violence against his battle brothers. Slanesh whispered suggestions for corrupting their discipline through excess. Nurgle offered gifts of resilience that would spread through the garrison like plague. Tzeentch proposed complex schemes that would take decades to unfold. "Choose," they demanded in unison, their voices creating cacophony that threatened his sanity. "Serve or die." Yet without Lorgar's guidance, without the careful theological framework that had once given purpose to their faith, the scattered word-bearers found themselves paralyzed by choice. Some pledged themselves to single gods, only to find their devotion torn apart by competing divine demands. Others went mad, attempting to serve all 4 powers simultaneously. Most simply fled, abandoning their posts rather than face the chaos that divine attention brought. Magnus the Red observed these patterns from his flagship, his enhanced perception tracking the surge in warp activity across multiple sectors. The Thousand Suns Primarch had established a network of psychic monitoring stations since the Davin incident, creating an early warning system that could detect large-scale spiritual corruption. Now those stations reported phenomena that defied classification. "Father," he said during his next private communication with Terra, "the warp storms are intensifying. Whatever entities we faced at Colchis, they're becoming more active, more desperate." The Emperor's response came after a long pause, his mental voice carrying weight that seemed to press against the boundaries of reality itself. "They have lost their primary agent in the material universe. Without careful guidance, they resort to crude approaches that reveal their presence." "Then we should capitalize on their desperation," Magnus suggested. "Use their obviousness against them. If they can no longer hide their corruption attempts, we hunt them down before they can adapt," the Emperor agreed. "Yet we must also be prepared for what comes next. Entities of such power do not remain desperate forever. They will learn from their failures and develop new strategies." The prophecy proved accurate sooner than either had anticipated. Even as Imperial forces began tracking and eliminating the obvious corruption attempts across the galaxy, deeper changes were taking place within the warp itself. The Chaos Gods were adapting, learning to work together in ways they had never attempted before. Where competition had once driven them to sabotage each other's efforts, desperation now forced cooperation. In the deepest recesses of the imperium, where thought became reality and emotion took physical form, the ruinous powers began to forge new strategies. They would need different agents, different approaches. The Primarchs had proven resistant to direct corruption, but they were not the only figures of power within the Imperium. The seeds of a new plan began to take shape, one that would target not the strongest links in the Imperial chain of command, but the weakest. Ordinary humans, driven by ambition or despair, could serve just as well as demigods if properly motivated. And unlike Primarchs, ordinary humans lacked the strength of will to resist direct divine attention. The whispers in the warp grew quieter but more focused, seeking new hosts for ancient hungers. The war for humanity's soul was entering a new phase, one where subtlety would be replaced by overwhelming force applied to carefully chosen targets. Magnus felt the change like a shift in atmospheric pressure, a sense that something fundamental had altered in the galaxy's spiritual ecosystem. Whatever came next would be different from what they had faced before. The question was whether the Imperium would be ready for evolution in their enemy's tactics. The first test of that readiness was already approaching, though none yet suspected where it would strike. The fortress world of Sebastus Prime had stood unconquered for 3 centuries, its quantum-locked battlements proof against every siege engine the galaxy had produced. Yet as Perturabo studied the tactical displays in his command bunker, the mathematical certainty of victory felt hollow. Another nameless world, another thankless siege, another campaign where the Iron Warriors would shed blood in anonymity, while other legions claimed the glory. The corruption began with whispers in the ventilation systems, voices that seemed to emerge from the very metal of the bunker walls. At first, Perturabo dismissed them as fatigue-induced hallucinations. He had been directing the siege for 6 months without rest, his enhanced physiology pushed to its limits by the constant demands of coordinating orbital strikes, tunnel networks, and infantry assaults. "You build cages," the voices murmured, their words carrying harmonics that resonated through the fortress's superstructure. "You tear down walls only to erect new ones. Is this truly what you were made for?" Perturabo's scarred hands paused over the holographic display, his augmetic eye focusing on defensive patterns that had taken him weeks to decode. The whispers were not random. They spoke to grievances he had nursed for decades, resentments that had grown like cancer in the depths of his mind. "You are the greatest siege master who ever lived," the voices continued, their tone shifting to something that might have been admiration. "Yet your father gives you thankless garrison duties, while lesser Primarchs bask in glory. Dawn builds walls and calls himself an architect. Guilliman conquers compliant worlds and proclaims himself a statesman. What recognition do you receive for mastering the most difficult form of warfare?" The Iron Warriors. Primarch straightened slowly, his massive frame casting long shadows across the tactical displays. Around him, his warriors continued their duties with mechanical precision, yet he noticed that several were moving with subtle changes in posture, heads tilted, as if listening to sounds only they could hear. "Who speaks?" Perturabo demanded, his voice carrying the authority of one who had commanded obedience from the most stubborn fortress walls in the galaxy. "Those who appreciate true worth," came the response, and suddenly the air shimmered with images that hurt mortal eyes to perceive. Perturabo saw himself ruling not a single legion, but a vast domain where his architectural genius shaped entire star systems. Worlds rebuilt according to his designs, their populations grateful rather than fearful. Recognition at last for achievements that dwarfed his brother's petty accomplishments. We offer you the respect you have earned, but never received. Serve us, and watch lesser minds bow before your brilliance. For a moment that stretched across eternity, Perturabo wavered. The offer touched every wound that decades of thankless service had carved into his soul. Yet something about the approach felt familiar, too direct, too crude. He had seen reports from other Primarchs about similar corruption attempts, desperate gambits by entities that had lost their most skilled manipulator. You speak of respect, he said carefully, yet you offer it like a commodity. True recognition cannot be granted. It must be earned through deed and acknowledged by equals. The presence pressed closer, and Perturabo felt the weight of a tension that existed beyond normal space-time. Your brothers are not your equals. They are inferior minds, playing at abilities you have mastered. Join us, and we will give you worlds to reshape according to your vision. My vision? Perturabo replied, his voice growing cold with dangerous precision, does not require cosmic patrons. The corruption attempt might have succeeded, if not for the arrival of an unexpected visitor. The bunker's blast doors opened with a hiss of equalizing pressure, and Rogel Dawn stepped into the command center. The Imperial Fist's Primarch moved with the careful grace of someone entering another's domain, his massive frame somehow managing to convey respect rather than intrusion. "Brother," Dawn said, his voice carrying the formal courtesy that had always marked their interactions. "I bring word from Terra." The whispers in the walls ceased as if cut by a blade, yet Perturabo could sense the presence withdrawing rather than departing, watching, waiting for opportunity to resume its manipulation. "What word?" Perturabo asked, gesturing for his brother to approach the tactical display. Dawn studied the siege patterns with the analytical mind that had made him the Imperium's greatest defensive architect. "The Emperor has decided to recall you to Terra. He wishes to discuss new assignments befitting your strategic importance." Something in Dawn's tone suggested deeper meaning, and Perturabo found himself studying his brother's face for clues. The two Primarchs had never been close, their approaches to warfare too different, their personalities too similar in their focus on precision and duty. Yet there was something in Dawn's manner that spoke of genuine concern. "Strategic importance," Perturabo repeated, tasting the words. An interesting phrase from the Master of Walls. "We must speak privately," Dawn said, his gaze sweeping across the Iron Warriors officers who continued their duties with professional detachment. "What I have to say concerns matters beyond this siege." They withdrew to Perturabo's private quarters, a Spartan chamber that reflected its occupants' focus on function over form. Here, surrounded by technical manuals and architectural blueprints, Dawn delivered news that would reshape the Iron Warrior's destiny. "Father has observed your recent campaigns," he began without preamble. "Your performance at Colchis, in particular, demonstrated capabilities that the Imperium cannot afford to waste on routine siege warfare." Perturabo's augmetic eye whirred as it focused on his brother's face. "Capabilities that you helped identify?" "I recommended your recall," Dawn admitted. "The Imperial Palace requires fortification against threats we are only beginning to understand. The entities we faced at Colchis will return, and when they do, Terra must be ready." The admission carried weight that went beyond military necessity. For Dawn to acknowledge his brother's superior expertise in siege warfare was unprecedented. The Imperial Fist's Primarch had never been one for false modesty or diplomatic flattery. "You surprise me, brother," Perturabo said carefully. I had not expected such recognition from you. Recognition? Dawn's scarred features showed genuine confusion. Perturabo, you are the finest siege master the galaxy has ever produced. Your achievements speak for themselves. I may excel at defense, but you have mastered both creation and destruction in ways that humble even my capabilities. The words struck Perturabo like physical blows. In all the decades since his discovery on Olympia, no one had spoken of his achievements with such direct acknowledgement. Not the Emperor, not his fellow primarchs, not even his own warriors who had followed him through countless campaigns. Yet the recognition always goes elsewhere, he said, his voice carrying decades of accumulated bitterness. Guilliman's tactical brilliance, Dawn's defensive genius, even Fulgrim's martial artistry. Where in the histories will they record the Iron Warrior's sacrifices? Dawn was quiet for a long moment, his analytical mind clearly processing the implications of his brother's words. When he spoke, his voice carried a note of something that might have been regret. History is written by those who survive to tell it, he said finally. Your warriors die more often than others because you accept the hardest assignments. Perhaps that is the problem, not lack of recognition, but surplus of responsibility without corresponding authority. The conversation continued deep into the night, covering topics that had never been discussed between them. Duty versus glory, recognition versus achievement, the price of being indispensable versus the reward of being appreciated. By dawn, something fundamental had shifted in their relationship. Terra's fortifications require complete redesign, Dawn said, as they prepared to depart Sebastus Prime. The enemy we face can manifest physically, reshape reality according to alien laws. Traditional defensive principles may prove inadequate. And you want my assistance, Perturabo said, his tactical mind already engaging with the challenge. I want your partnership, Dawn corrected. Co-equal authority over the palace's defensive architecture. Your expertise in siege breaking applied to defending against entities that can ignore conventional physics. The offer was unprecedented. Joint command of Terra's defenses represented recognition beyond anything Perturabo had dared hope for. Authority commensurate with his abilities rather than assignment based on availability. Yet even as they traveled toward the Sol system, the corruption within his legion made itself known. Captain Kroger approached his Primarch during the voyage with news that chilled even the Iron Warrior's disciplined ranks. My lord, he reported, his scarred features grim with barely controlled fury. We have discovered infiltrators within the Legion, former word-bearers who have been influenced by entities claiming divine authority. The interrogation that followed revealed the scope of the attempted corruption. A dozen Iron Warriors had been contacted by the same presence that had whispered to Perturabo, their resentments carefully cultivated over months of subtle manipulation. They spoke of visions showing the Legion's rightful place as rulers rather than servants, of cosmic entities that would reward their technical expertise with dominion over lesser mortals. Perturabo's response was swift and brutal. The corrupted Marines were executed without ceremony, their remains jettisoned into space rather than granted the honor of interment. Yet he reserved special attention for the word-bearer infiltrators who had orchestrated the corruption attempt. You offer godhood to those who already serve the greatest power in the galaxy, he told them as they knelt in chains before his judgment seat. The Emperor created us to be more than human. What could your entities add to that gift? Their leader, a former chaplain named Erebus, who had somehow escaped the purges, laughed with the confidence of someone who believed victory was inevitable. Recognition, he said simply. Gratitude for service rendered. Your false emperor treats you as tools to be used and discarded. We offer appreciation for your true worth." "My worth," Perturabo replied, raising his hammer, "requires no validation from cosmic parasites." The execution was performed personally, the Primarch's weapon reducing the infiltrators to component atoms while his warriors watched in absolute silence. Yet even as he cleansed the corruption from his legion, Perturabo understood how close he had come to damnation. The Whispers had found fertile ground in his legitimate grievances, using truth to make lies palatable. Only Dawn's unexpected recognition had provided the validation that made cosmic flattery unnecessary. The arrival at Terra revealed the scope of the threat they now faced. The Imperial Palace's defenses, while formidable by conventional standards, were utterly inadequate against enemies that could manipulate the fundamental laws of physics. Working alongside Dawn, Perturabo began designing fortifications that could withstand assault from entities that existed partially outside reality. "Quantum-locked foundations," he explained to the assembled engineers, his voice carrying the enthusiasm of someone finally given a challenge worthy of his abilities. "Psychically shielded command bunkers, overlapping fields of anti-warp energy that will force manifestations into purely physical forms." Dawn nodded approvingly, his own expertise complementing his brother's innovations. "Redundant defensive layers that can adapt to enemy capabilities we haven't yet encountered. Flexible rather than rigid, able to evolve as the threat changes." The partnership between Iron Warriors and Imperial Fists proved so effective that it caught the attention of the War Master himself. Horus arrived on Terra to review the defensive preparations, his noble features showing genuine admiration as he toured the construction sites. "Brother," he said to Perturabo during their private meeting, "I owe you an apology. The Mournival has discussed your campaigns extensively, and we have concluded that the Iron Warriors have been poorly utilized." The admission carried weight beyond mere words. For the War Master to acknowledge strategic error was unprecedented, particularly regarding resource allocation that had stood unchallenged for decades. "Your Legion will receive first choice of equipment requisitions going forward," Horus continued. "Priority access to new weapons and defensive technologies. And when Terra's fortifications are complete, I want you to work directly with my staff on long-term strategic planning." The recognition was everything Perturabo had sought, but never received. Authority commensurate with ability, acknowledgement from peers rather than superiors, partnership rather than subordination. Yet perhaps most importantly, it came without strings attached. No cosmic entities demanded payment for their gifts. No alien powers required worship in exchange for recognition. The validation came from those who understood the true scope of his achievements, fellow Primarchs who had seen what he could accomplish when given appropriate challenges. As the months passed and Terra's defenses took shape, the Iron Warriors found themselves working alongside other legions with unprecedented cooperation. The old resentments began to fade, replaced by professional respect earned through demonstrated competence. The whispers in the walls grew silent, their promises revealed as hollow echoes of what recognition truly meant. Chaos had lost one of its most strategically valuable potential allies, not through superior force, but through the simple acknowledgement of worth. Perturabo's loyalty had been tested and proven, his legion anchored by bonds stronger than any cosmic corruption could break. The balance of power in the coming war had shifted, though none yet understood how decisively. The night sky above 9 worlds burned simultaneously as reality itself convulsed under assault from powers that had learned to coordinate their hungers. For the first time since Lorgar's execution, the scattered servants of chaos moved in perfect synchronization, their actions guided by a mind that had transcended the limitations of mortal flesh. Cor Thyron, now something between demon prince and living conduit, orchestrated the greatest supernatural assault in imperial history from his throne within the imperium itself. The targets had been chosen with malevolent precision. Not the heavily defended fortress worlds or strategic manufacturing centers that conventional enemies might strike, but the recruitment worlds, those planets where each Space Marine Legion drew its aspirants from populations bred for genetic compatibility. Cripple these sources of future warriors, and the Imperium's military might would slowly wither over the coming centuries. Macrage's honor flickered first, its astropathic beacons screaming warnings that tore through the minds of every psyker within 3 sectors. The world that had given Gilliman his finest recruits for over a century now hosted incursions that turned its training grounds into killing fields, where aspirants faced trials no amount of preparation could have anticipated. Brother Captain Saul Tarvitz of the Emperor's Children led his company through streets that had become mazes of crystallized sensation, where every surface reflected desires that could drive even space marines to madness. The demon forces they faced belonged to Slanesh, entities of pure excess that sought to corrupt through pleasure rather than pain. "Maintain discipline," he commanded through the vox, his voice cutting through harmonics that promised experiences beyond mortal comprehension. "They seek to overwhelm through sensation. Trust your training, not your desires." The battle was unlike anything in his experience. Each blow landed against demon flesh sent waves of euphoric energy through his armor's sensory feeds, making combat feel like the most exquisite art form imaginable. His warriors fought with expressions of beatific joy, their disciplined formations slowly degrading as the enemy's influence made warfare feel like transcendent pleasure. Yet discipline held, barely. The Emperor's Children had been trained to pursue perfection in all things, and that perfectionist drive proved their salvation. They fought not for the pleasure of combat, but for the perfection of their duty, using their obsession with flawless execution to resist corruption that would have claimed lesser warriors. 3 sectors away, the world of Barbarous Prime faced a different form of damnation. Mortarian's recruitment world had become a laboratory where Nurgle's servants tested plagues that could infect even enhanced Astartes' physiology. The Death Guard who responded to the incursion found themselves fighting in an environment where the very air carried diseases that evolved faster than their immunity systems could adapt. Captain Nathaniel Garrow led his company through plague gardens that had once been training fields, his warriors' environmental seals providing only temporary protection against corruption that seeped through molecular bonds. The enemy here was not individual demons, but the transformed landscape itself, a living ecosystem where every breath carried potential infection. "The planet is lost," he reported through heavily encrypted channels, his voice carrying the weight of bitter necessity. "We can contain the outbreak, but purification will require exterminatus protocols." The Third World Shagoris Minor faced the fury of Khorne's servants. The horse-riding tribes that provided the White Scars with their fastest recruits now fled before demon cavalry that rode steeds made from crystallized violence. Yet the planet's response revealed the effectiveness of recent Inquisition training programs. Local defense forces that had been equipped with sanctified weapons and warded armor held their ground against entities that should have swept them aside effortlessly. The tribal chiefs who had learned to recognize signs of supernatural corruption coordinated resistance that bought precious time for imperial reinforcements to arrive. On Terra, the Emperor's response was immediate and decisive. The command center beneath the Imperial Palace had been transformed since Perturabo's arrival, its quantum-locked systems now capable of coordinating fleet movements across the galaxy with precision that would have seemed impossible months earlier. 9 simultaneous incursions, Magnus reported, his remaining eye blazing with silver fire as he processed information from psychic monitoring stations across the galaxy, targeting recruitment worlds for the Ultramarines, Death Guard, Emperor's Children, White Scars, Iron Hands, Raven Guard, Salamanders, Space Wolves, and one unknown location. The Emperor studied the tactical displays with eyes that seemed to perceive patterns beyond normal space-time. The 9th target? Masked by warp interference, Magnus admitted. The corruption is too dense for long-range scrying. It could be anywhere. Or it could be a trap, Perturabo interjected from his position at the engineering console. Draw our forces to 8 obvious targets, while the real threat manifests elsewhere. The Inquisition's response protocols, refined through months of preparation since their establishment, swung into action with mechanical precision. Inquisitor General Volk coordinated fleet movements from his command ship, the newly commissioned battle barge Truth's Clarity, while specialized Inquisition teams deployed to each affected world with equipment designed specifically for combating supernatural corruption. Iron Warriors to Chogoris Minor, Volk commanded, his voice carrying across Vox channels that spanned half the galaxy. Your siege expertise is needed to break demon fortifications, 1,000 Suns to provide psychic support, Emperor's Children to hold the line until reinforcements arrive. The coordinated response revealed how much the Imperium had learned from previous chaos incursions. Where once each legion would have responded independently, now they moved as part of a unified strategy that maximized each force's strengths while compensating for their weaknesses. On Fenris 3, the Space Wolves' recruitment world faced horrors that belonged to Tzinch, demons of change and mutation that twisted the planet's harsh landscape into geometries that violated natural law. The tribal warriors who hunted across the ice fields now found themselves prey to entities that could reshape reality with thought alone. Wolflord Gunnar Gunhilt led his great company through fjords that had become Mobius strips, their wolf spirits howling warnings about threats that existed in 11 dimensions simultaneously. The shamans who had guided his people for millennia now served as primitive psychers, their rituals adapted to combat entities that fed on change itself. Yet even as 8 worlds burned, it was the response to the 9th incursion that would prove most crucial. The masked location revealed itself at last, when Magnus's enhanced perception finally pierced the warp interference. A dead world in the ghoul stars that had been transformed into a fortress where surviving word-bearer commanders coordinated the entire assault. There, Magnus announced, his psychic sight finally penetrating layers of supernatural concealment. The source of the coordination signal, it's not just an incursion, it's a command center. The Emperor's decision was swift and absolute. Perturabo Magnus, prepare for immediate deployment. We end this at its source. The Iron Warrior's response to the hidden word-bearer stronghold showcased the evolution of siege warfare in the age of supernatural threats. Perturabo had spent months developing tactics for breaking fortifications that existed partially outside normal space-time, and now those innovations faced their ultimate test. The fortress that had been carved from the dead world's crust defied conventional description. Its walls shifted between states of matter, while cannon emplacements fired ammunition that existed in multiple temporal phases simultaneously. The very act of approaching the stronghold required navigating terrain where causality flowed backward and gravity pointed in directions that geometry could not accommodate. Conventional siege approaches are impossible, Brother Captain Forix reported, as his company established firing positions on what had once been level ground, but was now a vertical cliff that occasionally rotated through perpendicular dimensions. The fortress exists in flux. We cannot target what constantly changes. Perturabo's response demonstrated the mathematical genius that had made him the galaxy's premier siege master. Then we do not target the fortress. We target the mathematical constants that define its existence. The Iron Warrior's heavy weapons batteries opened fire not with conventional ordnance, but with specialized ammunition that Magnus had helped design, shells containing crystallized mathematical equations that forced supernatural phenomena to conform to logical parameters. Where the rounds struck, reality reasserted itself in expanding spheres of normal space-time. "Brilliant," Magnus observed from his position atop a crystalline tower that served as a psychic amplification node. "You are constraining their impossible architecture within possible frameworks." The siege that followed lasted 3 days of combat that redefined the very concept of warfare. Iron warriors fought demons in corridors that existed in 7 dimensions, while Thousand Suns provided psychic support that allowed normal weapons to affect supernatural enemies. The cooperation between legions was seamless, each force's capabilities perfectly complementing the other. Yet the cost was enormous. Brother Captain Erasmus Golg fell while leading his company against demon engines that fired temporal distortions instead of conventional rounds. His entire squad was erased from causality, their existence deleted so thoroughly that only Magnus's enhanced memory could recall their names. "The price grows too high," Magnus warned, as casualties mounted across both legions. "These fortifications are designed to extract maximum cost from every meter of advance." "Then we pay it," Perturabo replied, his scarred features set in granite determination. "The alternative is to allow this coordination center to continue operating." The breakthrough came when Iron Warrior heavy weapons finally punched through the fortress's primary command center, revealing the transformed figure that had orchestrated the 9-world assault. Kor Pharon sat upon a throne made from crystallized warp energy, his form no longer entirely physical, as demon essence merged with whatever remained of his mortal frame. "So you found me," he said, his voice carrying harmonics that existed in frequencies beyond normal sound. "Do you think destroying this shell will end what we have begun?" Perturabo approached the throne with weapons raised, his augmetic eye analyzing the mathematical patterns that held the Dark Cardinal's transformed existence together. "I think," he said carefully, "that you have become a problem that requires engineering solutions." The duel was brief but devastating. Kor Pharon had gained power beyond mortal comprehension, his form wreathed in energies that could unmake matter with thought alone. Yet Perturabo fought not as a warrior, but as an engineer, each blow precisely calculated to exploit the structural weaknesses in demon-forged flesh. When the Dark Cardinal fell for the second time, his death scream tore holes in reality itself. The coordination network that had linked 9 simultaneous incursions collapsed as its central node was severed, causing Dolmen forces across the galaxy to lose cohesion. Yet victory came at a price that would reshape Imperial strategy for years to come. 3 Space Marine companies had been destroyed entirely, their gene seed lost to corruption that made recovery impossible. 2 recruitment worlds required complete sterilization, their populations evacuated before exterminatus protocols were implemented. The economic cost of rebuilding would strain the Imperium's resources for decades. "The enemy has adapted," the Emperor observed, as reports filtered in from all 9 battlefields. "They no longer rely on individual corruption, but coordinated assault. They have learned to wage war as we do." Magnus nodded gravely, his enhanced perception tracking the ripple effects of the night's events. More concerning, is their targeting strategy. They sought to cripple our recruitment capabilities rather than achieve immediate territorial gains. This suggests long-term strategic thinking. Then we must think even longer term, Perturabo added, his tactical mind already calculating defensive improvements needed across the entire Imperium. If they can coordinate 9 simultaneous incursions, they can coordinate 90, or 900. The Night of 9 Worlds marked a turning point in the conflict between Chaos and the Imperium. For the first time, the forces of corruption had demonstrated the ability to wage coordinated warfare on a galactic scale. Yet the Imperial response had proven equally coordinated, with new institutions and partnerships proving their worth under fire. The war was escalating, but both sides were learning to fight it more effectively. The question was which would adapt faster, order or chaos, in the conflicts yet to come. As Imperial forces began the grim task of rebuilding what had been destroyed, one fact remained clear. The enemy they faced was no longer the scattered corruption of individual cults, but a unified force with strategic depth and long-term planning capabilities. The Long War had truly begun, and its conclusion lay far beyond the horizon of any mortal lifetime. In the depths of the warp, Corfaron's essence reassembled itself for the 3rd time, his defeat having taught him valuable lessons about the Imperium's new capabilities. Next time, he would not underestimate their unity or their willingness to pay the price for victory. The night sky above 9 worlds had burned. Soon it would be 10,000 worlds, or 1,000,000. The question was no longer whether such nights would come again, but how many the galaxy could survive. The smoke still rose from the ruins of Macrage's honor 6 months after the Night of 9 Worlds, yet the scars that truly mattered were not carved in stone, but in the hearts of those who had survived. Across the galaxy, on 8 worlds that had faced demon incursions, and countless more that had suffered the aftermath, the human cost of victory began to manifest in ways that no tactical manual had prepared the Imperium to address. Colonel Voss Kryn of the Cadian 47th stood before a mass grave that stretched beyond the horizon, watching his troopers execute their orders with the mechanical precision that had made the Imperial Guard the galaxy's finest conventional force. The civilians who knelt in endless rows had shown no obvious signs of corruption. No mutations, no blasphemous tattoos, no evidence of contact with supernatural entities. Yet the Inquisition's new protocols were absolute. Anyone who had been on Macrage's honor during the incursion must be considered potentially compromised. "Fire!" Kryn commanded, and 1,000 lasguns spoke in unison. The execution continued for hours, each volley adding another layer to the mountains of corpses that had become a common sight on worlds that had faced chaos attack. Men, women, children, the purges made no distinction based on age or apparent innocence. Corruption was invisible until it manifested, and by then it was too late. "Sir," Sergeant Gaunt approached with a data slate containing the next roster of condemned. "These are the children from the northern hives. Some of them weren't even born when the demons arrived." Kryn studied the list with eyes that had grown hard over months of such duties. Children as young as 5 years old, their only crime being present on a world that had suffered supernatural assault. The logic was unassailable. Chaos corruption could lie dormant for generations before manifesting. Yet something in the Colonel's soul recoiled at the mathematics of necessary evil. "Execute the order, Sergeant. The Inquisition's wisdom is not for us to question." Yet even as the purges continued, reports began arriving that challenged the very foundations of Imperial anti-chaos doctrine. Refugee ships fleeing the sterilized worlds carried more than just displaced populations. They carried stories of Imperial citizens who had begun to view the Imperium itself as a greater threat than the demons they had supposedly been saved from. On the agri-world of Thessia Prime, 3 sectors from the original attack sites, planetary governor Maxim Voronev faced a crisis that no amount of military training had prepared him for. His world had become a gathering point for refugees from the purged worlds, and among them moved whispers that chilled his loyal heart. "They say the demons offered them quick death," reported his aide, Captain Marco Volga, his voice barely above a whisper. "But the Imperium offers slow torment, years of suspicion, investigation, and eventual execution for crimes they never committed." Voronev studied the refugee camps through his office window, seeing the despair that had replaced hope in eyes that had once looked to the Imperial Eagle with reverence. "What would you have me do, Captain? Ignore Inquisition protocols? Risk my entire world for the sake of sentiment?" "No, sir. But perhaps we might request clarification of the protocols. Surely not every refugee poses the same level of risk." The request for clarification never reached its intended destination. Instead, it triggered an investigation into Governor Voronev's loyalty that would consume his remaining years in interrogation chambers beneath the planetary capital. The message was clear. Questioning the Inquisition's methods was itself a form of heresy. Yet such questions were beginning to emerge in circles where heresy was supposedly impossible. In the halls of the Imperial Palace itself, several Primarchs had begun to voice concerns about the direction their father's Imperium was taking. The secret conclave that gathered in Guilliman's private chambers represented a fundamental challenge to Imperial unity, though none of the assembled demigods would have characterized it as such. Robert Guilliman himself had called the meeting, his noble features bearing the weight of reports from across Ultramar's domain. Beside him stood Vulcan, the gentle giant whose legion had been forced to participate in civilian executions on 3 different worlds. Sanguinius was present through holographic projection, his angelic countenance troubled by visions that showed possible futures too dark to contemplate. "We are becoming the enemy we sought to defeat," Guilliman said, without preamble, his voice carrying the authority of one who had governed star systems since before most humans drew breath. "The Inquisition's methods are creating more corruption than they prevent." Vulcan nodded gravely, his massive hands clenched into fists that could crush ceramite. "My warriors report increasing resistance to Imperial authority on worlds that have been cleansed of chaos influence. Populations that once welcomed us now flee at our approach." "The visions grow darker each day," Sanguinius added, his projected form flickering with the strain of maintaining contact across galactic distances. "I see futures where humanity turns against itself, where fear of corruption becomes corruption itself. We are walking a path that leads to damnation of a different sort." The discussion continued for hours, covering topics that would have been considered treasonous if overheard by the wrong ears. The Primarchs spoke of limiting the Inquisition's authority, of establishing oversight mechanisms that could prevent the worst excesses of paranoid zeal. They discussed ways to protect innocent civilians from purges that seemed to grow more indiscriminate with each passing month. Yet even as they planned, darker intelligence arrived from the sectors closest to the recent chaos incursions. For the first time in Imperial history, human populations were actively seeking protection from chaos forces rather than Imperial ones. The reports came from the Mordian Iron Guard, whose regiments had been assigned to patrol the edges of the purged zones. Captain Eisenstein delivered the news with the mechanical precision of a soldier who had learned not to question orders, no matter how disturbing their implications. 3 separate civilian convoys have been intercepted attempting to reach known Chaos cult strongholds, he reported to Lord General Militant Varus. When questioned, the refugees claimed they preferred honest damnation to imperial justice. The general studied the tactical displays with eyes that had seen too much over the past months. What manner of propaganda could turn imperial citizens toward such madness? Not propaganda, sir. Experience. These refugees had survived the initial Daemon attacks, only to watch their families executed by our forces during the subsequent purges. They believed death at Chaos hands would be more merciful than life under imperial suspicion. The implications were staggering. The Imperium's own anti-chaos measures were driving civilians toward the very corruption they sought to prevent. Worse, the logic was understandable. A quick death-serving dark gods might indeed seem preferable to years of suspicion, followed by inevitable execution, for crimes that existed only in the paranoid imagination of inquisitorial investigators. Reports of such defections began arriving with increasing frequency. Entire planetary populations had begun to view imperial forces as occupying armies rather than protectors. Sectors that had remained loyal through centuries of alien invasions were now questioning whether the Imperium truly served humanity's interests. On Terra, Malcador the Sigillite brought these reports directly to the Emperor, his ancient features bearing the weight of wisdom accumulated across millennia. The regent had lived through the dark age of technology, had seen what happened when humanity's institutions turned against the people they were meant to serve. "The cure is becoming deadlier than the disease," he said, spreading data slates across the Emperor's private study. Sectors that have never faced chaos corruption are beginning to resist imperial authority. Planetary governors who have served loyally for centuries are being investigated for asking reasonable questions about purge protocols. The Emperor listened in silence, his golden eyes reflecting calculations that spanned centuries of future planning. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority, tempered by the recognition of necessary compromise. "The Inquisition serves a vital function, old friend. Without it, chaos corruption would spread unchecked across the galaxy. Yet you are correct that its methods require refinement." "The Primarchs grow restless," Malcador continued. "Several have begun to question our policies openly. Guilliman speaks of establishing oversight mechanisms. Vulcan refuses to participate in further civilian purges. Even Dawn has expressed concerns about the sustainability of current protocols." "Dissent among my sons was inevitable," the Emperor replied, his tone carrying neither surprise nor disappointment. "They are not machines to follow orders without question. Their capacity for independent thought is what makes them effective generals. Yet that same capacity makes them prone to sentiment that could prove catastrophic." The conversation was interrupted by an urgent Vox transmission from Magnus the Red, his psychic voice cutting through the palace's protective wards with the authority of one who had been granted extraordinary access to his father's attention. "Father," Magnus's mental voice carried undertones of barely controlled alarm, "I must report a development that threatens the very foundations of our anti-chaos strategy. The purges are creating psychic resonances in the warp itself, fear, despair, and hatred on such a massive scale that the ruinous powers are feeding on it directly." The implications were immediate and terrifying. The Imperium's efforts to combat chaos corruption were themselves generating the emotional energy that powered their supernatural enemies. Every execution, every purge, every act of paranoid suspicion added to a growing reservoir of negative emotion that entities beyond the veil could harvest for their own purposes. "Elaborate," the Emperor commanded, his psychic presence extending toward his son across the vast distances that separated Terra from the 1,000 suns' current deployment. "The mathematics are clear," Magnus replied, his mental voice carrying the weight of calculations that had consumed weeks of his enhanced cognitive capacity. "Fear generates Tzeentch-aspected energy. Despair feeds Nurgle. The rage of those who see their families killed for non-existent crimes empowers Khorne, and the excessive brutality of some purge operations provides sustenance for Slaanesh." The revelation struck at the heart of Imperial strategy. In seeking to starve chaos through the elimination of corruption, they had instead created new feeding grounds through the emotional trauma inflicted on innocent populations. The enemy was being nourished by their very efforts to destroy it. "Recommendations?" the Emperor asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer would require painful choices. "Reduce the scope of purge operations. Focus on confirmed corruption rather than potential contamination. Accept that some risk is preferable to the certainty of feeding our enemies through excessive brutality." The decision that followed would reshape Imperial policy for the remainder of the Great Crusade. New protocols were established that required confirmation of actual corruption before executions could be authorized. Oversight mechanisms were put in place to prevent the worst excesses of inquisitorial zeal. Most importantly, resources were redirected toward rehabilitation programs that could cleanse minor corruption without requiring the death of those affected. Yet even as these reforms were implemented, the damage done during the months of indiscriminate purges continued to manifest. Sectors that had experienced the harshest measures remained unstable, their populations nursing grievances that would take generations to heal. The first instances of Imperial worlds petitioning for independence had already been recorded. Their grievances centered not on alien oppression or economic exploitation, but on the brutality of their supposed protectors. The Iron Warriors, now serving alongside the Imperial Fists in Terra's defense, had been assigned to monitor these rebellious sectors. Perturabo's reports painted a picture of discontent that extended far beyond the worlds that had faced direct chaos attack. 17 sectors show signs of potential rebellion, he reported during a War Council meeting. Not rebellion inspired by chaos corruption, but rebellion against Imperial authority itself. The populations believe, not without justification, that the Imperium has become more dangerous to human life than the enemies it claims to fight. The irony was not lost on anyone present. In seeking to protect humanity from spiritual corruption, the Imperium had begun to corrupt itself, not through supernatural influence, but through the mundane evil of excessive force applied to innocent populations. "The question before us," Guilliman added, "is whether we can rebuild the trust that has been lost. Populations that view us as occupiers rather than protectors will be vulnerable to any force that offers them genuine protection, including chaos cults that present themselves as resistance movements." The war against chaos was evolving once again, but this time the evolution was not tactical or strategic. It was moral. The Imperium faced the challenge of remaining worthy of the loyalty it demanded, of protecting humanity without destroying the very human values that made such protection meaningful. In the depths of the warp, the ruinous powers observed these developments with satisfaction that transcended mere tactical advantage. The Imperium was learning to question itself, to doubt the righteousness of its cause. Such doubt was more valuable than any daemon army, for it came from within and could not be destroyed by force of arms. The long war continued, but its battlefield had expanded beyond physical space to encompass the very soul of human civilization. Victory would go not to the side with the strongest armies, but to the one that could maintain its principles while doing what was necessary for survival. For the first time since Lorgar's execution, the outcome was genuinely uncertain. The intercepted Vox transmission that would reshape the Imperium's understanding of loyalty itself arrived during the darkest hour of the Infernus campaign, when Imperial forces found themselves surrounded by chaos cults that seemed to anticipate their every move. The message, broadcast on frequencies that should have been impossible to access, contained intelligence so precise and actionable that it could only have come from sources embedded deep within the enemy's command structure. "Grid coordinates follow," the voice said, its modulation disguised beyond recognition, yet carrying undertones of authority that suggested noble birth. 3 primary cult strongholds. Strike simultaneously at 0800 hours local time. Be advised, civilian populations in sectors 7 through 12 have been compromised and require immediate purification. Marshal Corgan of the Astra Militarum studied the coordinates with the suspicion of a veteran who had learned that gifts from unknown sources usually carried hidden costs. Yet the intelligence proved accurate beyond any reasonable expectation. The simultaneous strikes eliminated 3 chaos strongholds that had resisted Imperial assault for months, their defenses crumbling as if the attackers possessed perfect knowledge of every weakness. The victory should have been cause for celebration. Instead, it raised questions that cut to the heart of Imperial security. How had the mysterious benefactor acquired such detailed intelligence? Why provide aid without identifying themselves? Most disturbing of all, how could anyone outside the Imperial command structure have access to communication frequencies that were supposedly impossible to infiltrate? The answers, when they came, arrived in a form that challenged every assumption about loyalty, betrayal, and the nature of service to the Emperor's cause. The revelation began with the appearance of 2 figures in the command bunker of the 47th Expeditionary Fleet, materializing without triggering any of the sophisticated detection systems that protected against supernatural intrusion. One wore the blue-green power armor of the Alpha Legion, his helmet bearing the Hydra sigil that marked him as a member of the 21st Legion. The other was identical in every detail, save for subtle variations in posture that spoke of different experiences despite genetic similarity. "I am Alfarius," said the first figure, his voice carrying the authority of one accustomed to command. "And I am Alfarius," said the second, creating an immediate contradiction that seemed to amuse both speakers. Lord Commander Solar Macarius, veteran of 100 campaigns and witness to wonders that would have driven lesser men to madness, found himself struggling to process what he was witnessing. The Alpha Legion had been scattered across the galaxy for decades, their companies integrated into other forces after questions arose about their loyalty following the Word-Bearer's corruption. To see their Primarch, or Primarchs, appear without warning suggested capabilities that bordered on the supernatural. "Explain your presence," Macarius demanded, his hand moving instinctively toward his weapon, despite the futility of threatening a Space Marine Primarch with conventional arms. "We come to reveal truths that will reshape your understanding of this war," the first Alfarius replied. "Truths that concern the nature of loyalty itself and the prices that must be paid to ensure humanity's survival. For years we have played a game of such complexity that even our brother Primarchs could not comprehend its scope," added the second Alfarius. "A game where appearing to serve chaos was necessary to prevent chaos from achieving ultimate victory." The explanation that followed would test the moral foundations of everyone who heard it. The Alpha Legion had not been corrupted by chaos influence. They had deliberately infiltrated chaos forces at the highest levels, embedding themselves so deeply within enemy command structures that they could manipulate outcomes without revealing their true allegiance. Every cult we appeared to support was ultimately destroyed through intelligence we provided, the first Alpharius continued. Every demon incursion we seemed to enable was guided toward targets that minimized Imperial casualties while maximizing Chaos losses. We have spent decades engineering defeats for forces that believed us to be their allies. Yet the cost has been enormous, admitted the second Alpharius, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been regret. Entire populations sacrificed to maintain our cover. Worlds allowed to fall to preserve the greater strategy, the mathematics of survival written in innocent blood. The revelation explained much that had puzzled Imperial strategists in recent years. Chaos offensives that had collapsed due to inexplicable command failures. Critical intelligence that had arrived at precisely the right moment to prevent catastrophic defeats. Enemy forces that had turned on each other just as victory seemed within their grasp. You allowed the Night of Nine Worlds to proceed, Lord Commander Macarius said, his voice carrying the weight of accusation. 3 recruitment worlds were lost because you needed to preserve your infiltration network. We minimized the casualties, the first Alpharius replied without emotion. Without our guidance, Chaos forces would have targeted 27 worlds simultaneously. Our intervention reduced the scope of the assault and ensured that Imperial responses would arrive in time to prevent complete destruction. The mathematics are clear, added the second Alpharius. Hundreds of thousands died to save millions. Yet we understand why such calculations might seem monstrous to those who lack our perspective. The debate that followed would rage through Imperial command structures for months to come. On one side stood those who argued that the Alpha Legion's methods, while brutal, had demonstrably saved more lives than they cost. Their infiltration of Chaos forces had provided intelligence that proved crucial in dozens of victories, disrupting enemy operations on a scale that conventional warfare could never have achieved. On the other side were those who maintained that collaborating with Chaos forces, even as a deception, represented a fundamental corruption that could never be justified. The populations sacrificed to maintain the Alpha Legion's cover were not abstract numbers, but human souls whose deaths demanded accounting. Magnus the Red, summoned to Terra to provide psychic analysis of the Alpha Legion's claims, delivered a report that only deepened the moral complexity of their situation. Their loyalty to the Emperor is genuine, he informed the assembled War Council, his remaining eye blazing with the effort of penetrating deceptions that operated on multiple levels simultaneously. Yet their methods have exposed them to Chaos influence in ways that may have permanent consequences. They walk a razor's edge between salvation and damnation, and even they may not know which side they will ultimately fall upon. The Emperor's response was characteristically direct. Rather than denounce or embrace the Alpha Legion's methods, he assigned them a test that would demonstrate the true scope of their capabilities, while minimizing the risk of further civilian casualties. 3 Chaos strongholds remain in the Segmentum Solar, he commanded during a private audience with both Alphari. They have resisted conventional assault for months. If your infiltration network is as extensive as you claim, eliminate them without Imperial casualties. The operation that followed showcased the Alpha Legion's capabilities in ways that left even veteran Imperial commanders struggling to comprehend what they had witnessed. The 3 strongholds, fortified asteroid bases that had seemed impregnable, fell within 72 hours through a combination of sabotage, misdirection, and precisely timed internal rebellions that turned Chaos forces against each other. Impressive, Rogaldorn admitted as he studied the after-action reports. Yet the very ease of their success raises troubling questions about the extent of their infiltration network. Those questions proved prophetic when subsequent investigations revealed that several loyal Imperial forces had been Alpha Legion operatives for years. Guard regiments that had distinguished themselves in battle against chaos cults were discovered to contain squads whose true loyalty lay with the 20th Legion rather than their nominal commanders. "How many others?" Guilliman demanded, during an emergency session of the War Council. "How many of our loyal forces are actually Alpha Legion operatives pursuing agendas we cannot comprehend?" The paranoia that followed was exactly what the Alpha Legion had anticipated. Their revelation of extensive infiltration capabilities served multiple purposes. It demonstrated their value as allies while simultaneously creating distrust that would make coordination between potential traitors more difficult. "The Hydra has many heads," the first Alpharius observed to his twin during a private conversation aboard their flagship. "Cut off one deception, and 3 more take its place." "Yet we must be careful," replied the second Alpharius. "The Emperor tolerates our methods because they produce results. Should we become more dangerous to imperial unity than to chaos forces, he will not hesitate to eliminate us, as he did Lorgar." The balance they maintained was indeed precarious. Intelligence continued to flow from Alpha Legion sources, enabling imperial victories that would have been impossible through conventional means. Yet each success came with the uncomfortable knowledge that it had been achieved through methods that violated every principle of honor and transparency that the Great Crusade supposedly represented. Captain Nathaniel Garrow of the Death Guard expressed the moral complexity most clearly during a strategic planning session. "We accept intelligence from sources embedded within chaos forces. We act on information obtained through the sacrifice of innocent populations. We celebrate victories achieved through methods we would condemn if used by our enemies. What then separates us from the corruption we claim to fight?" The question had no easy answer, which was precisely what made it so dangerous. The Alpha Legion's revelation had demonstrated that the line between necessary deception and fundamental corruption was far thinner than anyone had believed. Their success in preventing chaos victories through controlled opposition raised the possibility that other such operations might be necessary. "Perhaps," suggested Vulcan, during one of the increasingly frequent debates about Alpha Legion methods, "the real corruption is not their willingness to infiltrate chaos forces, but our willingness to accept the benefits of their infiltration." The philosophical implications extended far beyond military strategy. If the Alpha Legion could maintain loyalty to the Emperor while appearing to serve chaos, what did that suggest about the nature of loyalty itself? Could service to the imperial cause justify any methodology, no matter how morally questionable? The Emperor's own position remained characteristically unclear. He continued to utilize Alpha Legion intelligence while maintaining careful oversight of their operations. The message was subtle but unmistakable. Results mattered more than methods, but methods had consequences that could not be ignored indefinitely. "We are what the galaxy has made us," the first Alpharius observed to Lord Commander Macarius during their final meeting before the 20th Legion returned to the Shadows. "Humanity requires protectors willing to bear the moral burden of necessary evils. We carry that burden so others need not." "Yet who protects humanity from its protectors?" Macarius replied. "If you are willing to sacrifice populations to maintain your cover, what prevents you from sacrificing the Emperor himself if your calculations suggest it serves the greater good?" The question hung in the air like an accusation, and for the first time since their revelation, both Alphari seemed genuinely uncertain of their response. "That," said the second Alpharius finally, "is a risk you will have to accept. For the alternative, facing chaos without intelligence from within their ranks promises far greater casualties than any we might inflict." As the Alpha Legion disappeared back into the galactic shadows, they left behind a legacy of paranoia and moral uncertainty that would haunt Imperial command structures for years to come. Their revelation had demonstrated that the war against chaos required methods that violated the very principles the Imperium claimed to defend. The Hydra's gift was victory, achieved through controlled treachery. The question that remained was whether humanity could accept such gifts without losing its soul in the process. In the depths of the warp, entities that fed on doubt and uncertainty stirred with satisfaction. The Alpha Legion's revelation had accomplished something that direct corruption attempts had failed to achieve. It had introduced moral ambiguity into the heart of Imperial command. Such ambiguity was more valuable than any daemon army, for it came from within and could not be destroyed by force of arms. The long war continued, but its battlefield had expanded beyond physical space to encompass the very nature of truth, loyalty, and the price of survival. Victory would go not to the side with the strongest armies, but to the one that could maintain its principles while doing what was necessary for victory. For the first time since the war began, neither side was certain what those principles actually were. The Golden Throne had never been intended as a weapon of war. Yet, as the Emperor gazed upon the psychic amplification matrix that Malcador had spent decades perfecting, he knew that desperate times demanded adaptations beyond the device's original design. The massive structure, crafted from archaeotech that predated humanity's first steps among the stars, hummed with energies that could tear holes in reality itself. "Father," Magnus said, his remaining eye blazing with silver fire as he studied the modifications being made to the throne's primary systems. "The risks are beyond calculation. To project your consciousness directly into the warp realm while maintaining connection to your physical form. Even my understanding of psychic mechanics finds this approach theoretically unsound." The Emperor turned from his examination of the quantum-locked containment fields that would anchor his physical form while his spirit walked between dimensions. "The alternative is to allow our enemies time to adapt to every strategy we employ. They learn from each defeat, grow stronger from each confrontation. Direct action has become the only viable option." The decision to assault the Chaos Gods in their own realm had not come easily. Weeks of strategic analysis had revealed a pattern that chilled even the master of mankind's immortal heart. Chaos was evolving. Without Lorgar's corruption network to provide subtle infiltration routes into Imperial territory, the ruinous powers had begun manifesting directly into reality, with increasing frequency and sophistication. "They no longer need mortal servants," the Emperor had explained to the assembled War Council during the meeting that would reshape the Imperium's destiny. "Each failed incursion teaches them more about the barriers between dimensions. Eventually, they will learn to bypass those barriers entirely." The implications were staggering. If chaos entities could manifest at will without requiring mortal summoners or physical anchor points, the very concept of defending against their corruption would become meaningless. They could appear anywhere, at any time, in unlimited numbers. "The mathematics support Father's analysis," Magnus had added, his voice carrying the weight of calculations that had consumed his enhanced cognitive capacity for months. "Current trends suggest they will achieve stable manifestation within 2 centuries. At that point, conventional military resistance becomes impossible. The solution, when it came, was characteristically direct in its ambition and terrifying in its scope. If chaos could reach into the material universe, then the Emperor would reach into theirs. The ultimate battle would be fought not on physical worlds, but in the realm of pure thought and emotion, where the ruinous powers held absolute dominion. "You propose to fight gods in their own heaven," Rogel Dawn observed, his scarred features revealing nothing of his thoughts. "The tactical implications are challenging. "I propose to prove they are not gods," the Emperor corrected. "They are parasites that have grown fat on humanity's spiritual energy. Remove them from their source of sustenance, and they become merely powerful psychers operating in a realm where raw will determines reality." The preparations took months, requiring innovations in psychic technology that pushed even the Emperor's vast knowledge to its limits. The Golden Throne was modified with quantum-locked systems that could maintain a stable connection across dimensional barriers. Additional psychic amplifiers were constructed using principles that Malkador had discovered in the deepest archives of lost human civilization. Yet for all the technical complexity involved, the human element proved most crucial. The Emperor would not venture into the warp alone. Such a journey would require guides who understood its treacherous currents and could navigate by landmarks that existed only in the collective unconscious of sentient beings. "I will accompany you," Magnus declared during a private audience in the depths of the Imperial Palace. "My knowledge of the warp's structure is unmatched among the Primarchs. Together, we can chart courses through regions that would be impassable for a single consciousness." The Emperor studied his son with eyes that seemed to perceive the very atoms that comprised his being. "The risk to you would be enormous. In the warp, you would be vulnerable to corruption attempts that could succeed where previous efforts have failed." "Then we must ensure they do not succeed," Magnus replied with quiet determination. "The alternative, allowing chaos to achieve stable manifestation, threatens not just the Imperium, but the entire concept of ordered existence." The debate among the Primarchs was fierce and immediate when the plan was announced. Gilliman spoke for those who saw the gambit as necessary despite its risks, arguing that proactive action was preferable to reactive defense against an increasingly adaptive enemy. "We cannot win a defensive war against opponents who learn from every engagement," he stated with the authority of one who had mastered the art of strategic planning. "If Father believes direct assault offers our best chance of victory, then we must support that choice regardless of personal misgivings." Perturabo, who had spent months fortifying the Imperial Palace against supernatural assault, approached the question from an engineering perspective. "The defensive modifications we have implemented can protect Terra against conventional incursions. But if Chaos entities achieve stable manifestation, physical defenses become irrelevant. Eliminating the threat at its source represents sound tactical logic." Yet other voices raised concerns that cut to the heart of what the plan represented. Vulcan, whose gentle nature had been tested beyond endurance by the recent conflicts, spoke for those who questioned whether victory achieved through such means could be considered victory at all. To assault the Chaos gods in their own realm is to risk becoming what we fight, he said, his massive frame radiating concern that transcended mere tactical considerations. "The warp changes those who venture into it. How can we be certain that Father will return unchanged by such exposure?" "We cannot," the Emperor replied with characteristic honesty. "Yet the alternative is certain defeat. I would rather risk corruption in service of humanity's survival than accept damnation through inaction." The practical preparations for the assault required innovations that pushed the boundaries of what Imperial technology could achieve. The Golden Throne's psychic amplifiers were linked to generators that drew power directly from Terra's core, creating energy patterns that could be detected from orbit. Additional safeguards were implemented to ensure that the Emperor's physical form would remain protected, while his consciousness ventured into hostile dimensions. The Iron Warriors and Imperial Fists worked in unprecedented cooperation to establish defensive perimeters around the throne chamber, their combined expertise creating fortifications that could withstand assault from entities operating outside normal space-time. quantum-locked barriers prevented dimensional intrusion, while psychic wards maintained by teams of sanctioned psychers created stable zones where reality operated according to consistent physical laws. "If something goes wrong," Perturabo explained to his brother Dawn as they oversaw the installation of the final defensive systems, "these barriers will contain any warp contamination to the immediate area. The rest of the palace will remain protected." "And if the Emperor does not return?" Dawn asked, his voice carrying implications that neither warrior wanted to contemplate. "Then Malcador becomes regent in truth rather than title, and we prepare for the longest siege in human history." The departure, when it came, was witnessed by only the most trusted members of the Imperial Inner Circle. The Emperor took his place upon the Golden Throne as its modified systems hummed to life, psychic energy building to levels that made even hardened space marines step back from the mounting power. "Malcador," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, tempered by something that might have been affection. "You know what must be done in my absence." The sigillite bowed his ancient head. "The Imperium will endure, my lord. Whatever comes, humanity's light will not be extinguished while I draw breath." Magnus stood at the Emperor's right hand, his psychic presence merging with his father's as they prepared for translation into realms where thought became reality and emotion took physical form. The Thousand Suns. Primarch had spent weeks preparing for this moment, attuning his consciousness to frequencies that would allow him to serve as navigator through the chaotic currents of the immaterium. "Ready?" the Emperor asked, and Magnus nodded with determination that transcended fear. The translation itself was unlike anything ever attempted in human history. The Emperor's consciousness, amplified by the Golden Throne's modified systems and guided by Magnus's expertise, punched through the barriers between dimensions like a spear thrust through paper. The psychic shockwave of their passage rippled across the galaxy, causing every psyker within 50 sectors to cry out in either ecstasy or terror. What they found on the other side challenged even the Emperor's vast understanding of reality's fundamental structure. The warp was not simply another dimension, but a reflection of conscious thought itself, where every emotion that had ever been experienced by sentient beings created landscapes of impossible beauty and unimaginable horror. "The realm of pure mind," Magnus observed, his consciousness taking the form of crystalline geometry that reflected his preference for mathematical precision. "Here, will and reality are synonymous." "Then we impose our will," the Emperor replied, his presence manifesting as a figure of blazing gold that burned with the accumulated faith of billions of human souls. "And we do so absolutely." The first phase of the assault targeted the minor entities that served as extensions of the Chaos God's influence. Demons and demon princes that had grown powerful through centuries of feeding on mortal emotion. These beings, formidable as they seemed to material minds, proved vulnerable to direct confrontation from consciousnesses that refused to accept their superiority. The battle was fought not with weapons, but with competing concepts of reality, where the demons sought to impose their nature, corruption, violence, excess, change. The Emperor and Magnus countered with absolute rejection of such concepts. The result was annihilation on a scale that sent shock waves through the warp itself. "Impossible," whispered entities that had existed since before the first human learned to count, as their essence was systematically unraveled by minds that refused to acknowledge their right to exist. The success was immediate and devastating. Dozens of minor chaos entities simply ceased to exist, their forms dissolving as the fundamental assumptions that gave them shape were challenged by wills more powerful than the combined faith that had created them. Yet even as victory was achieved, Both the Emperor and Magnus sensed stirring in the deepest reaches of the warp, ancient powers awakening to confront the invasion of their realm. The Chaos Gods themselves were beginning to take notice of the assault on their domain. "They come," Magnus warned, his consciousness detecting approaching presences that dwarfed anything they had yet encountered. "The true powers of this realm move against us." "Then we meet them," the Emperor replied, his golden radiance blazing brighter as he prepared for confrontation with entities that had shaped the destiny of countless civilizations. "And we prove that consciousness shaped by will can triumph over consciousness shaped by emotion." The first phase of the gambit had succeeded beyond all expectation. Minor chaos entities had been banished permanently, their destruction sending ripples of confusion through chaos forces across the galaxy. Yet the real test was still to come, as the ruinous powers themselves began to converge on the invaders who dared to challenge them in their own realm. On Terra, those who waited for news of the Emperor's progress found themselves caught between hope and terror. The psychic emanations from the Golden Throne had changed, becoming something that spoke of battles fought on scales that mortal minds could barely comprehend. Malcador stood watch beside the Emperor's physical form, his ancient features showing strain that had nothing to do with fatigue. He alone among mortals could perceive echoes of what was happening in the warp, and what he sensed there filled him with both pride and dread. The Master of Mankind had begun a war that would determine not just the fate of humanity, but the very nature of consciousness itself. Victory would secure humanity's future for eternity. Defeat would ensure that no future existed to secure. The gambit had been cast. Now came the ultimate test of whether will could triumph over chaos in the realm where both were absolute. The return was heralded not by trumpets or astropathic fanfare, but by silence, a sudden, profound quiet that settled across the warp like dawn breaking over a battlefield. Every psyker within 100 sectors felt it simultaneously, the moment when two of the ruinous powers simply ceased to exist, their essence unraveled by a will that refused to accept their reality. The Emperor's physical form stirred upon the Golden Throne after 73 days of motionless vigil, his golden eyes opening to reveal depths that held the memory of battles fought in realms where mathematics had no meaning. Yet the figure that gazed upon the assembled watchers was changed in ways that went beyond mere physical damage, though that damage was severe enough. "My lord," Malcador whispered, his ancient face creased with relief and concern in equal measure. Where the Emperor's right arm had been, only twisted scar tissue remained, the limb having been unmade by contact with entities whose very existence violated natural law. More concerning were the injuries that could not be seen, wounds to his psychic presence that would never fully heal. "It is done," the Emperor said, his voice carrying harmonics that made the walls of the throne chamber resonate with barely contained power. Khorne and Tzeentch are no more. Their essences have been scattered across the deep warp, their consciousness dissolved into component emotions. Magnus knelt beside the throne, his remaining eye blazing with silver fire as he processed the implications of what they had accomplished. The 1,000 Suns. Primarch bore his own scars from the venture. His psychic sight now operated in spectrums that mortal minds were never meant to perceive, showing him truths about reality's structure that would haunt him for eternity. "The other two withdraw," Magnus reported, his voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who had witnessed the death of gods. "Nurgle and Slaanesh retreat to the deepest reaches of the Imperium. They will not dare to manifest directly for centuries, perhaps millennia." The victory's cost became apparent in the weeks that followed. The Emperor's injuries were more severe than even his enhanced physiology could easily repair. The psychic wounds inflicted by divine adversaries who had commanded the worship of countless civilizations would require decades of healing, leaving him weakened in ways that could never be fully addressed. Yet the strategic implications were immediate and profound. Across the galaxy, chaos cults that had drawn power from the now destroyed entities found themselves cut off from their supernatural patrons. Demons bound to the service of Khorne, and Tzeentch simply evaporated, their forms unable to maintain cohesion without the cosmic forces that had given them shape. The systematic hunting of remaining chaos forces began immediately, coordinated by an inquisition that had evolved far beyond its original mandate. Under Malcador's guidance, the organization had developed into something resembling a shadow government, one dedicated not to political power, but to the eternal vigilance required to prevent humanity's spiritual corruption. Every cult stronghold has been identified, Inquisitor General Volk reported during the first War Council meeting following the Emperor's return. Without their divine patrons, the remaining forces lack coordination and supernatural support. We estimate complete pacification within 18 months. Yet even as Imperial forces celebrated the systematic destruction of Chaos strongholds, one final threat remained. Deep in the eye of terror, where reality itself was negotiable, and the laws of physics served only as suggestions, Khorne prepared for a last desperate gambit that would either secure his revenge or destroy everything he had worked to preserve. The former word-bearer had transcended his physical limitations through bargains struck with entities that existed between the cracks of creation itself. Neither truly demon nor mortal, he had become something that could survive the death of the gods he had served. Now, with his cosmic patrons destroyed or fled, he channeled their remaining essence into one final assault on the world that had witnessed his humiliation. The attack on Terra came without warning, launched from a dimension that no longer officially existed. Khorne materialized in the skies above the Imperial Palace, with a host of entities that had been cobbled together from the dying echoes of destroyed Chaos gods, creatures that existed in violation of the new reality that the Emperor's victory had established. "You thought yourself victorious," his voice boomed across Terra's surface, carrying harmonics that made mountains tremble and caused aurora to dance across the planet's magnetic field. But victory is meaningless if there is nothing left to rule. The final battle was brief but devastating. The fortifications that Perturabo and Dawn had spent years perfecting proved their worth against enemies that operated outside conventional physics, while the psychic wards maintained by teams of sanctioned psychers created zones where reality operated according to consistent laws. Yet it was the Emperor himself who ended the threat, rising from the Golden Throne, despite his injuries, to confront the last representative of the corruption that had threatened to consume humanity. The duel was fought not with weapons, but with competing visions of what reality should be: order against chaos, construction against destruction, hope against despair. When Khorne's essence finally dissipated, scattered beyond any possibility of reformation, his last words carried a prophecy that would haunt the Imperium for generations to come. Even in victory, you plant the seeds of what you sought to destroy. The vigilance you require will become the tyranny you create. The transformation of the Imperium in the years that followed validated that final prophecy in ways both troubling and necessary. New institutions arose from the ashes of the chaos threat, each one designed to prevent the spiritual corruption that had come so close to destroying humanity. The Inquisition evolved into a permanent fixture of imperial governance, its agents granted authority to investigate any citizen regardless of rank or station. The ecclesiarchy was established, ironically fulfilling Lorgar's vision of organized worship, though directed toward the imperial truth rather than supernatural entities. Most significantly, Space Marine training was enhanced with extensive education about chaos corruption and the methods needed to resist spiritual influence. "We have become what we never intended to be," Guilliman observed during a gathering of Primarchs held 5 years after the final victory. "A civilization defined more by what we oppose than by what we seek to build." "Perhaps that was inevitable," Vulcan replied, his gentle nature having been tempered by years of witnessing the price of insufficient vigilance. "The universe has shown us that existence itself requires constant defense, better to be defined by our vigilance than destroyed by our complacency." The surviving Primarchs adapted to their new roles with varying degrees of success. Some, like Dawn and Perturabo, found purpose in the endless task of fortifying the Imperium against threats both known and theoretical. Others, like Sanguinius, struggled with the militarization of human society and the gradual erosion of the idealistic principles that had once driven the Great Crusade. Yet perhaps the most significant change was in the Emperor himself. The injuries sustained during his assault on the Chaos Gods had not healed as expected, leaving him permanently weakened in ways that forced fundamental changes to imperial governance. For the first time since his ascension to absolute authority, he began to delegate meaningful power to his subordinates. "The time approaches when humanity must learn to stand without its father's constant guidance," he confided to Malcador during one of their increasingly frequent private discussions. "The Primarchs must be prepared to assume greater responsibility, for I may not always be available to provide it." The succession planning that followed was characteristically methodical, with each Primarch assigned specific spheres of influence that would allow them to govern effectively in the Emperor's absence. Guilliman assumed responsibility for civilian administration. Dawn took charge of military defense. Magnus oversaw psychic matters and anti-chaos operations. The distribution of power was careful, calculated to prevent any single figure from accumulating enough authority to threaten imperial unity. 100 years later, the Imperium of Man presented a face to the galaxy that would have been recognizable to its founders, yet fundamentally different in character. The idealistic dream of bringing enlightenment to human worlds had been replaced by the grimmer necessity of eternal vigilance against threats that dwelt beyond the boundaries of sanity. Inquisitor Titus Valdane walked the corridors of a fortress monastery on the world of Cadia, observing training exercises that would have seemed impossible during the early days of the Great Crusade. Space Marines sparred against holographic representations of demons while reciting litanies designed to strengthen their resistance to spiritual corruption. Novice initiates studied texts that detailed the 1,000 ways corruption could manifest, their education encompassing threats that had once been so secret that knowledge of them carried a death sentence. "The galaxy remains hostile," he noted in his weekly report to the Ordo Malleus, "yet humanity endures. The measures implemented following the Chaos Wars continue to prove their effectiveness. No major incursions have been detected in this sector for 37 years. On Terra, the Golden Throne hummed with energies that maintained the psychic beacon known as the Astronomicon, while simultaneously powering defensive systems that protected not just the Imperial Palace, but the entire Sol system from supernatural assault. The Emperor, though weakened, continued to guide humanity's destiny through careful manipulation of imperial institutions and the gradual education of his sons in the arts of governance. "We have purchased survival," he said during a rare public appearance before the assembled Lords of Terra. "Yet the price was higher than any of us anticipated. We are no longer the species we were when this war began. Perhaps that is as it should be. Evolution demands adaptation, and we have adapted to a universe where innocence is a luxury that invites extinction. The Great Crusade continued, though its character had changed beyond recognition. Where once imperial forces sought to liberate human worlds from alien oppression or technological ignorance, now they brought a different kind of salvation. Protection against threats that could not be fought with conventional weapons. Every compliance included extensive screening for chaos corruption, while every victory was followed by the establishment of monitoring systems designed to detect spiritual contamination before it could spread. "We are gardeners now rather than conquerors," Magnus observed during one of his regular psychic communions with his father, tending to humanity's spiritual health with the same care that farmers show for their crops. The comparison was apt in ways that went beyond mere metaphor. Just as farmers must remain constantly vigilant against blight that could destroy entire harvests, the imperium had learned to watch for the spiritual diseases that could corrupt entire worlds. The price of such vigilance was the gradual militarization of human society and the erosion of freedoms that had once been considered fundamental rights. Yet for all the changes, for all the compromises made in the name of survival, humanity endured. The species that emerged from the Chaos Wars was harder than its predecessors, more suspicious, more willing to sacrifice individual freedom for collective security. But it remained recognizably human in its capacity for hope, for love, for the stubborn refusal to surrender in the face of impossible odds. Children born on worlds that had never seen demon incursions learned prayers that would protect them against entities they might never encounter. Scholars studied texts that detailed corruption techniques, preserved only to better understand how to resist them. Soldiers trained for battles against enemies that violated the fundamental laws of physics. It was not the future that Lorgar had envisioned when he first proclaimed the Emperor's divinity. It was not the galaxy that the Chaos Gods had sought to create through corruption and spiritual slavery. It was something new, a civilization defined by its refusal to surrender to the darkness, no matter what that refusal might cost. The Emperor stood upon the highest tower of the imperial palace, gazing out across Terra's restored landscape while contemplating the reports that arrived daily from across the galaxy. Humanity's children scattered among 1,000,000 worlds, each one a candle flame holding back the darkness that would forever press against the borders of ordered existence. "There is no end," he said to the wind that carried his words across continents that had witnessed the birth and death of empires beyond counting. "There is only eternal vigilance, only the endless task of remaining worthy of survival." The long war was over, but the longer war, the struggle to remain human while doing what was necessary for humanity's survival, had only just begun. It was a war that would be fought not with armies or fleets, but with individual choices made in moments when no one was watching, when the easy path led toward corruption, and only the difficult road preserved the soul. Yet as the Emperor watched Terra's sun set behind clouds that had been shaped by technologies beyond ancient understanding, he allowed himself a moment of something that might have been satisfaction. The species he had sworn to protect survived, changed, perhaps scarred, but not broken. That was enough. It would have to be enough. For in a universe where gods fed on mortal despair and entities beyond comprehension sought to reduce consciousness itself to playthings for their amusement, simply remaining human was victory enough to justify any sacrifice. The new dawn had risen, and humanity, in all its flawed and stubborn glory, would greet whatever challenges that dawn might bring.